Dzień dobry wieczór. Miałem coś sprawdzić jeszcze i zapomniałem. Tłumienie hałasu. Czy ja mam jakąś bramkę nałożoną? Albo mnie odcina, bo jestem za głośno. Może się ciut ściszę. Może tak być. Bo jak sobie próbowałem ostatnio, tam montowałem film, bo tak, robi się, ale przede wszystkim jakoś w tym tygodniu będę zamawiał książkę, tą gigantyczną książkę o cudach. Znaki z nieba i z tego będzie duża analiza, ale montuję też inny wideo esej krótki i mi odcinało audio, więc chciałem trochę poeksperymentować, o co mogło chodzić. Dzień dobry, co tam u was? Witam. Witam Donżur, witaj starszy ateisto obwodowy. Siema Nyx, pierwszy raz na live'ie. Witamy serdecznie w gronie sceptyków. E, Dobry wieczór, mówi Adrianna, super poniedziałek. Dla kogo super, dlatego super. Dobry wieczór, witam wszystkim. Ed, cześć. Unicornication Supporter, cześć wszystkim. Mrozu Bartu, cześć niedowiarki. Dobrej wieczerzy wszystkim, mówi Bartek Stachu. Kaszka pisze, dzień dobry. Joanna, cześć, w końcu dotarłam na live. Bardzo się cieszę. Cześć Bogu, cześć wszystkim. Witaj Igorze, Mace, pierwszy raz na żywo, pozdrawiam wszystkich. Pozdrawiam również Wiktorię. Siema. Dobra, więc plan na dzisiaj jest taki, że zobaczymy sobie materiał, albo część materiału, zobaczymy jeszcze ile będzie mi się chciało, dotyczącego Demiurga. Strasznie się podjarałem, jak zobaczyłem temat i zacząłem sobie tam trochę o tym czytać, bo to jest taka rzecz bardzo niszowa, nawet w tym takim około filozoficzno-sceptyczno-religijnym półświadku. Z uwagi na to, że Demiurg to jest pewna dość mistyczna i interesująca interpretacja biblijnego Boga, prawda? Związane jest to, wydaje mi się, również z apokryficznymi Ewangeliami, czyli tymi Ewangeliami, które z różnych względów, ale rzadko spowodowane jakimiś względami obiektywnymi, części Ewangelii, które usunięto z kanonu biblijnego. Dzisiaj posłuchamy sobie o Demiurgu, ale same też Ewangelie, które zostały wykreślone, czy fragmenty tekstu różnego rodzaju, w sensie jeżeli chodzi o gatunki literackie, które kiedyś składały się na jakąś tam wersję Biblii, są w ogóle fascynującym tematem, mimo że kiedyś warto będzie się temu przyjrzeć. Więc to będziemy dzisiaj robić, a potem zobaczymy. Mam taki pomysł, żeby odpalić jakąś gierkę, ale to dla relaksu i później, kiedy już mi mózg będzie wysiadał. Starszy ateisto, pięknie dziękuję za małego topczata. Dobry wieczór Bogu. Co tam, jak tam? U mnie wszystko w porządku, ale intensywnie, słuchajcie, w tej takiej, powiedzmy, zwykłej pracy, więc jestem trochę zmęczony ostatnimi czasy. No ale co zrobić? Trzeba za coś żyć. Cześć, fajny gościu. No właśnie, jak chcecie, żeby mi się żyło trochę lepiej i żebym miał pieniądze na drobne przyjemności, to zawsze możecie wesprzeć mnie topczatem na YouTubie. Tam trzeba kliknąć ikonkę dolara koło okienka i można wysłać. Też za każdym razem, jeżeli ktoś wyśle topczata, to odniosę się do tego, co w tym topczacie napiszę. Cokolwiek by to było, o ile nie będzie obraźliwe, metoda na zachęcanie osób do wsparcia kanału, nawet czymś bardzo, bardzo drobnym. Dobrze. Okej. No to w takim razie, mając przywitania z głowy, odpalmy sobie historię Demiurga okiem Alexa Connora. Jak zawsze uwielbiam jego podcast. Coś wspaniałego ten podcast. I jego gościa, którym jest prowadzący kanał Ezoterika, który na pewno zaraz się nam pięknie przedstawi. Ja sobie będę zerkał raz na jakiś czas do czatu i oczywiście będziemy się odnosić i dyskutować wspólnie treści, które będą poruszane. Rzućmy może prędkość 1,5 i zobaczmy.
And some other religions as well.
Co nie krzyczycie, że nie słychać? O, właśnie. Krzyczycie tylko z opóźnieniem. Shit. Well, anyway. Widzieliście przez chwilę tekst? Ale od razu jest temat, do którego warto się chyba odnieść. Tak, wcześniej powstał odcinek, w którym panowie dyskutowali o historii biblijnego Boga. W sensie takiej historii. To znaczy o tym, jak Jahwe wyodrębnił się ze swojego panteonu bogów, z których pochodzi i jak krok po kroku, zazwyczaj bardzo krwawo, wywalczył sobie pierwsze miejsce w panteonie tamtejszych przedkananejskich wierzeń, a potem został zaadoptowany przez grupę nomadów jako ten jedyny Bóg, którego tylko jego można było czcić. No takie są korzenie biblijnego Boga, uchwycone poprzez oczy historyków i to jest zawsze jakiś taki interesujący punkt, który lubię poruszyć, że korzenie naszych religii sięgają bardzo głęboko do bardzo takich plemiennych wręcz klimatów. I fakt, że obecnie na przykład chrześcijańska apologetyka czy filozofia okołoreligijna służąca do argumentowania zaistnieniem bogów czy tego czy innego Boga powstała i rzeczywiście ma się dobrze, to nie pamiętajmy, że ta cała apologetyka, która obecnie istnieje, jest niejako nakładką na wierzenia, które od zarania dziejów były raczej dość plemienne. Staram się jak mogę uniknąć słowa prymitywne. I kiedyś działał na mnie taki argument, albo nie, to zachowam sobie na później. Starszy ateista, czy mam cię dalej ścigać o wizytę u światusów? Tak, jak tylko wpadnie mi pomysł na temat, z którymi mógłbym do nich uderzyć, to się uderzę. Ja mam się podbić jeszcze? No dobra, podbiłem się.
That God is a person, not an abstract entity. It's not the philosopher's God. It really is it really is a person, and like all people, that person has a history. And there's something about that, the reality that God has a history, that Yahweh has a history, that I think. Again, we talked about this off air. That there's something about that does, I think, so much more heavy lifting in terms of getting people to think about theological questions, philosophically or religiously, much more so than any philosophical argument I ever had with a believer. That those arguments just go right off them like water off a duck. They can look at the problem of evil, Epicurus's famous contradiction, and go, "I don't really care about this. I still believe in God." And you could do the straight formalization of the argument and show them like this is a contradiction, and you have to give up something to relieve the contradiction. And they'll go, "Nah, no, I don't. I'm done. I'm fine." But if you do this Yahweh thing and say, "Look, we have good reason to believe that this deity has a history," there's something about that they can't. I think people can't shake in quite the same way. Because we're all convinced of the reality of history, and we're all committed to telling history correctly, and that's all well and good until your God has a history, and then that's deeply unsettling.
It's probably a bit like when you get old enough to realize that your parents are just people, the people that you've sort of just seen as these unshakable foundations of provision, if you're lucky enough to have such parents. One day you grow up, you get into your 20s, your 30s, maybe you have children yourself, and you begin to look at your parents as people who themselves have hopes and desires and get lonely and get sad and stressed. And there's something about that which demystifies parenthood. And so I think a lot of people report that as they get older, they sort of become more like friends with their parents.
Tak, bo to jest, bardzo chcę się do tego odnieść, totalnie chcę się do tego odnieść, bo to jest coś takiego, że argument pod tytułem skąd wiesz, że istnieje, że Jezus jest prawdziwy i że istnieje chrześcijański Bóg, a nie na przykład panteon greckich mitów, znaczy greckich bogów, no to takim najczęstszym, to jest taki argument jest uznawany, jest jakby zbywany, albo uznawany za żart, czy to smaczny, czy niesmaczny, ale nie jest to żaden argument w dyskusji, no bo apologeci i ludzie argumentujący za istnieniem Boga obecnie używają no takich bardzo wysublimowanych, filozoficznych argumentów i próbują argumentować z historii, etc., etc. Natomiast to, o czym jakby wydaje mi się wszyscy od czasu do czasu zapominamy, to, że chrześcijaństwo, wcześniej judaizm, a wcześniej te wszystkie wierzenia związane z jachwistycznym Bogiem, z Jahwe, miały dokładnie takie same korzenie. I teraz powód, dla którego obecnie mamy tak dużo filozofii i apologetyki, którą jest obudowana religia, na przykład chrześcijańska, a mity greckie nie są, a bogowie greccy nie są, to jest po prostu, to mogą być po prostu koła historii, prawda? W alternatywnej rzeczywistości, w której Cesarstwo Rzymskie na przykład by przetrwało, albo Imperium Greckie, powiedzmy, to znaczy, że ta cywilizacja by nie przekształciła się w jakiś sposób, nie zmodyfikowała, nie zmieniła i te wierzenia by pozostały, ludzie dalej by wierzyli, nie przyszłoby chrześcijaństwo, ludzie dalej by wierzyli w greckich bogów, jest bardzo, bardzo, bardzo moim zdaniem prawdopodobne, że w obecnym świecie mielibyśmy dokładnie ten sam kazus. To znaczy, te wszystkie takie wręcz plemienne, mitologiczne elementy greckich mitów zostałyby tym, czym obecnie są cechy Boga Jahwe i opisy Boga Jahwe ze Starego Testamentu, czyli historia, metafory, trochę nie wiadomo, przekazy ustne i tak dalej, ale popatrzcie, to jest nasza podstawa do tworzenia zaawansowanej filozofii i apologetyki, nie wiem, dowodu z matematycznie dostrojonego wszechświata, czy dowodu ontologicznego lub zespołu argumentów kosmologicznych. W sensie to samo można by zrobić dla bogów greckich, tyle, że po prostu bogowie greccy, tamtejsze religie zostały wyparte przez chrześcijaństwo, przez islam i tak dalej, i tak dalej, i tak dalej. Więc kiedyś myślałem, że faktycznie, że można by jakby odrzucić jakieś takie, skąd wiesz, że Ozyrys, egipski bóg, tak naprawdę nie siedzi gdzieś w Hadesie i nie mówi: cholera jasna, dlaczego nikt już we mnie nie wierzy? Wszyscy wierzą w Jahwe, w Allaha albo w inne dziwne teraz tam rzeczy, w reptilian, a nikt nie wierzy we mnie. No nie wyczymię, prawda? I ten argument uznawałem, że sensownym jest odrzucić, no bo to mitologia, to jakieś tam stare wierzenia, bogowie z głowami psów i tak dalej, i w ogóle nie. Real deal, to znaczy, przepraszam za słowo angielskie, za angielski trend, taka prawdziwa, głęboka filozofia i wartościowa dyskusja może się dziać wtedy, kiedy weźmiemy sobie tego Boga filozofów, tą nakładkę Boga filozofów i nałożymy ją na chrześcijańską historię i chrześcijańskie wierzenia. Ale to mi się zmieniło. Albo możemy sobie wziąć na przykład takie pomniejsze religie, weźmy sobie jakieś plemiona amazońskie, które wierzą w bardzo swoich specyficznych bogów. I chrześcijanie i generalnie cywilizacja zachodnia, wierząca część cywilizacji zachodniej, ale również ja jako sceptyk, często tak to wiadomo, to jakieś tam przekonania, wiecie, ludzi, którzy nie znają filozofii, którzy tam biegają na bosaka po dżungli i prowadzą takie mocno prymitywne, plemienne życia. Ale teraz sądzę, że po pierwsze, jaki to argument? Równie dobrze oni mogą mieć rację, a my możemy się mylić. To po pierwsze. A po drugie, gdyby na przykład zachodnia cywilizacja, gdyby na przykład to w Puszczy Amazońskiej tamtejsze plemiona wykształciły wysoce rozwiniętą cywilizację taką, jaką mamy obecnie, to myślicie, że w tej południowoamerykańskiej, alternatywnej, wyższej cywilizacji byłoby wierzenie, że jest Bóg drzew, który sprawia, że rosną nam owoce na drzewach, albo że łatwiej nam, nie wiem, upolować tapira, czy że nie przychodzi do nas anakonda? No nie. Stałoby się, stawiam, to samo, co w cywilizacji zachodniej. To znaczy wierzenia te dość prymitywne, plemienne wierzenia, takie, które mocno się kojarzą z mitologią, zostałyby przekształcone w metafory albo w symbole, a na to nabudowana by została wysublimowana, zaawansowana filozofia i apologetyka, tak jak w przypadku wierzeń chrześcijańskich. I dlatego myślę, to o czym tutaj panowie mówią, o tym, jaki szok wywołał ich odcinek o tym, gdzie zajmowali się historią biblijnego Boga, pokazując, że tak, że on pochodzi z takich samych korzeni. Kiedyś wierzyły w niego proste plemiona nomadów i był to Bóg wojny i składano mu barany w ofierze. I to jest szokujące, bo jak to tak, ta nasza wysublimowana chrześcijańska wiara i Jezus, który za nas umarł na krzyżu, a tak naprawdę mitologiczne korzenie? No nie może tak być. No nie może tak być. Dlatego mi się wydaje to bardzo ciekawy argument, który łączy się w ogóle z moim argumentem dotyczącym mnogości religii jako dowodu na nieprawdziwość tej konkretnej religii. Który to, by the way, argument ludzie uznają, że jest bardzo słaby. Ja dalej uważam, że jest dobry.
Look at their parents as someone to sort of hang out with, someone to check in with, someone to look after, and that sort of shift can be quite sort of seismic, I think. And
Yeah. Or when you
I think
come to the
something like that
realization
is
that
going on here.
your parents can't do something. I remember that
Yeah.
moment where you have this sort of Freudian moment where your father can't do the thing and he's working on the car and gets frustrated and like hits the car with the wrench and you're like, hold on, dad can't. And then,
Yeah.
there's a sort of Freudian moment in that. Or just, I've heard Christians also tell me that the moment when they realize that Santa Claus isn't real, that they realize, hold on, like, so spoiler alert, that they find the presents in their attic or something, and all of a sudden the magic just evaporates. And
Thank you
again,
for
that's not
disclosure.
my.
Now I'm going to have to put an age rating on this episode to
Yeah,
prevent the kids
sorry.
from,
Yeah,
from seeing.
let kids learn. I always tell I'm going to have shirts made for my kids that say,
Święty Mikołaju,
your parents are really Santa
nie!
Claus. On the back, it'll say Happy Hanukkah. I'm actually not going to do that because I don't want my kids to get in a lot of trouble.
That
yeah.
might be how they realize that their dad is not the most powerful agent in the world as you parade them down the street.
Yeah, probably not a good idea.
I think something like that must be going on with this Yahweh stuff. It's just no matter what you find about the history of this God, the fact that it is a being that develops, that changes, that seems to be beholden to certain historical contingent facts about the way that humans are interacting, is demystifying. As I say, if you're a Christian or something, it might shake your faith a little bit. But as a non-Christian, it's also just incredibly interesting. That's why recently I've been doing a deep dive, as my regular listeners will know, into some of the sort of proto-Christian ideas and some of the early Christian communities that are now forgotten or condemned. And the Gnostic Gospels have been a big focus of mine. And throughout this
Właśnie to jest to
investigation,
słowo, którego szukałem. Ewangelie gnostyczne.
there's this character that
Między innymi Ewangelia Judasza.
keeps cropping up wherever I look, be it in the Gospel of Judas, be it in the Apocryphon of John, be it potentially in the Old Testament. There's this character that crops up, which is kind of like a god, but it's kind of this weird, potentially evil or malevolent god, maybe a stupid or incompetent god, one that sort of creates the material world and is a little bit, and does so in such a way as not to benefit humankind, keeps sort of cropping up throughout the Gnostic literature. And the most popular term that I hear ascribed to this being is the Demiurge. You are midway through a series of an undisclosed number of videos, as of yet, on this character of the Demiurge, and I'm hoping that today we can start to try to unpack who this person is.
Yeah, I think that again, this is also the topic of the Demiurge also has a sort of zeitgeist. People are really interested in this character as well. And I will also say that this was one of the most shocking ideas to come out of the ancient world. And I say shocking and scandalous, really, because not only did it scandalize other Christians found this idea completely horrifying. Even other pagans, Plotinus famously, wrote against this idea. So this was an idea that was so unsettling to many people at the time that you got, everyone from Irenaeus to Plotinus, coming at this idea and saying, this is unacceptable, this is horrifying. And I think that the Demiurge carries that. And this idea that the creator of this world might be malevolent has crept up over and over and over again. We keep telling this story at some level, and as recently as things like The Matrix, where the creators of this reality are somehow evil robots or something. That's just a version of this sort of demiurgic, malevolent creator mythology. And I find it interesting that we continue to invent and reinvent that myth. And so, yeah, it'll be fun to get into the topic of the Demiurge and what a strange theological shift to come to the conclusion that God, at least the God of this realm, is evil. And what a real what a kick to the head in some ways.
Yeah, we're going to dive into this because a lot of questions are already sort of bursting out. We're talking about this concept of this evil, malevolent creator deity, but I've also talked about it in the context of early Christian communities who believed in it. But to be a Christian, surely you have to believe in the all-good creator of the universe, the Jesus Christ, the savior figure. And yet we're talking here about this malevolent, evil creator of the world. It can all be a little bit confusing, but we're going to unpack it all. We're going to describe it. We're going to see how this all fits into different worldviews. I think the best place to start is perhaps at the start. Where does this term demiurge first appear? Because there might be some people listening who say, I've heard this word thrown around, but I literally just don't even know what it is that you're talking about. It sounds like something out of Dungeons and Dragons. What is a demiurge? Where does it come from originally?
Yeah, the term just means craftsman. So it's a very normal Greek term that would be used for any craftsman, but it emerges primarily in Plato, in the Timaeus, probably one of Plato's top 5 most important or most widely read texts. In fact, the only text to survive into the Latin West of Plato through the Middle Ages was the Timaeus. So in the Timaeus, Plato gives what he calls a likely story or a likely myth. And ikota muthon, he calls it a likely narrative, because again, he wasn't there and he doesn't know how the world came into being. But basically, what he argues for is something along the lines of the principle of sufficient reason. There's a world, there must be a reason for that. And what is the reason for the world? What caused the world? Well, this demiurge, the craftsman made the world. And the way that it works in the Platonic mythology, or again, this likely story, is that Plato imagines, right, there's a world of the forms, and the world of the forms is an unchanging, perfect world, sort of a collection of all the blueprints of ideas that comprise, the eternality of all things, the ideas. And what we have is the demiurge is there too. It's not really clear where the demiurge comes from, so we can always ask, where did this entity come from? And Plato doesn't give us a story about that. But what ends up happening is that the demiurge looks to the forms and uses the forms by impressing them upon matter. And matter, or hule, is imperfect. It is by nature imperfect. It's
Okej. Czy demiurg to jakiś ponadczasowy stwórca, rzemieślnik, który istnieje w platońskiej świecie idei i bierze te idealne idee i stwarza świat poprzez nakładanie tych niesamowitych, ponadczasowych, niematerialnych idei na materię, kształtując tą materię, tylko że materia jest nieidealna. Dlatego jest ten klasyczny problem platońskiego trójkątu, że tak naprawdę trójkąt to jest idea, jakiś abstrakt. I my możemy tworzyć trójkąty, ale nigdy to nie będą trójkąty idealne. One będą dążyć do jakiejś swojej idealnej formy, która jest poza materią. Shit! To jest całkiem interesujący koncept.
changeable. It is not eternal. It is in the realm of becoming. And what ends up happening is that the demiurge takes the eternal forms and impresses them upon matter and generates ultimately various Platonic geometric forms. And because matter is inherently imperfect, what ends up happening is that the forms are imperfectly impressed within the matter. And that means that we live in a world that is optimal. The creator, the demiurge, did the best that he could, but it is not perfect. The world of the forms is perfect. The world of matter is not. And therefore, we live in an imperfect world, but it's still an optimal world. In a sort of Leibnizian kind of, this is the best of all possible worlds. In some sense, this is the best a demiurge could have done, given the imperfection of matter, but the perfection of the forms. And therefore, we live in an imperfect, but not bad world. And so Plato's whole gist here is, when we look at, for instance, a beautiful person, and we see the beautiful person, beauty, the form of beauty, is impressed, or they're impressed upon the matter that they are. Or another way of putting it is, the matter participates in beauty, and rather than focusing on the physical beauty of the person, rather we should focus on the formal reality of beauty. And when we focus on the formal reality of beauty, then of course we are more in communication or more in participation with what is fundamentally real, which is the forms. So basically, Plato's telling us a story about how form became embedded in matter and why matter is not perfect. And I think anyone can look around and realize at some level that no matter how perfect you attempt to make a triangle out of, I don't know, clay, your clay triangle is never going to be as perfect as the abstract Euclidean concept of a triangle. And Plato's trying to understand or develop what he calls, again, a likely story about how we arrive at a situation in which we do have the perfect notion of a triangle if we conceive it intellectually, but there are no perfect triangles in actual matter. And so he's trying to bridge that gap. And he develops the theory of the demiurge, or the myth of the demiurge, to do that philosophical, but also, not only is it philosophical, but it's also, cosmological. It's a cosmological story about the origins of the physical world.
Yes. Interestingly, it brings to mind the fact that I'm pretty sure David Hume, who famously is an empiricist, meaning he thinks that all of our knowledge ultimately stems from our observations of the world, thought that we couldn't know that two parallel lines will never intersect. The fact that two parallel lines will never intersect, he thought, we can't know that because we've never seen two perfect parallel lines. Everyone we've seen in reality will always be slightly imperfect, and so we've no way to know that these lines will never intersect, because we can't just have a perfect
Hume z Rikczem. Hume z Rikczem. Tak, podoba mi się. No tak, teoretycznie oczywiście, biorąc pod uwagę matematykę, to jak narysujesz dwie równoległe linie względem siebie, no to one nigdy się nie spotkają. Ale czy możemy to wiedzieć? Ponieważ w rzeczywistości nie jesteśmy w stanie stworzyć linii, które będą idealnie do siebie równolegle. Wyobraźmy sobie, że rysujemy dwie równoległe linie, ale jedna jest o 1 miliardową, prawda, przesunięta. To już znaczy, że potencjalnie daleko, daleko te linie by się przecięły. Hume z Rikczem, jak zawsze.
idea in our head that doesn't connect to something that we've seen in the past, which is, I think, in many ways a reductio ad absurdum, perhaps, of Hume's empiricism. But at least we can agree on the point that the physical world is imperfect. And here Plato is offering a likely account, a myth, about why this might be the case. And crucially, we have an explanation here for why a sort of perfect creator, a good creator, a powerful creator, would yet create a world which is not itself perfect. Some people like to hypothesize that, because the world is imperfect, the creator must have been evil, he must have been wanting humans to suffer or something
A mógł być po prostu niekompetentny ten kreator. Creator, czyli twórca.
like this. Crucially, we don't get that idea yet. With Plato, it's just a sort of incompetence, but not an incompetence because of something wrong with the god. It's an incompetence because of something to do with the matter that he's working with. But there's still no sense in which we're dealing with like an evil creator here yet, right?
No, not at all. The God, the demiurge in Plato is good. It is in some sense perfect. And again, you can imagine it a bit like trying to build a bookcase out of bad lumber. No matter how good of a carpenter you are, if you get warped, knotty, bad lumber, well, the bookcase can only be as good as the lumber. And that's true of the demiurge. The world's only going to be as good as the stuff that it's made from. And matter,
Fascynująca jest ta
again,
historia.
not evil. This is a really important thing, that Plato's not a dualist. Matter's not evil. It just can't be perfect. And it's just limited. And that limitation, is cashed out for Plato in the reality that when
Ale jeżeli demiurg jest w sferze form i nakłada formy, idealne formy na materię, w ten sposób formując świat materialny, to skąd się wziął ten świat materialny? Skąd wzięła się ta surowa materia, na którą potem demiurg nakładał formę? To jest interesujące. Nie wiem, czy Platon o tym pisze.
we take the perfect form again of triangle or beauty, there is no instantiation of perfect beauty or perfect justice in matter. It just isn't possible. But that's not to say that there is no justice and there is no beauty in the world. Of course there is, according to Plato. It's just that the demiurge could only do the best with what the demiurge had to work with, and matter by its nature is imperfect. Now, that's not to say that we're going to eventually move in the direction of dualism, where matter is discounted, and Plato begins that process himself. Matter is deeply discounted, and Plato, and eventually by Neoplatonism, will have Plotinus, for instance, famously say, or at least Porphyry famously said of Plotinus, that he was ashamed to have a body. That that the idea that the body is somehow so deeply flawed and imperfect that one should be ashamed of it at some level. We don't quite have that yet in Plato, but we do have the nucleus of that kind of dualism in Plato, in that the forms in the world of being are perfect, and hule, the world of matter, is somehow inferior to that. The world of becoming is inferior. That's already the nucleus of what will become a kind of almost perennial Western dualism that we've never totally been able to shake.
We'll get back to Justin Sledge in just a moment, but first, did you know that Pope Francis recently said that refusing to aid migrants is a, quote, grave sin? It might depend on the kind of news you read. If the sources reporting possibly across the world leaning of Tory, note iron even have usually of all/unlimited. We also have about the Demiurge are simple for as little as $5 a month. And with that said, back to Justin Sledge. And what we also have here is our simple defining of terms. We know that a demiurge means something like craftsman, and when we're talking about the demiurge, whether it's evil, good, incompetent, whatever, what we're talking about is the creator of the material world. And so Plato has this creator, unable to create perfection out of imperfect materials. Where do we start getting this idea that there's something more detestable about the material world, perhaps something a little more sort of distance between the good, perfect form, God, divine realm type stuff, and, bad matter type form stuff?
I think we see it already in Plato, that there's sort of a discounting of the physical world and the discounting of physicality. In the same way that, again, when I see a beautiful person, I should turn my attention not to the physical person, which is perishable. They're in the world of becoming, but rather I should attune my soul to beauty itself. And insofar as I participate in beauty itself, I am, somehow my soul is nourished by that, and perhaps will enjoy some kind of better afterlife if we follow the myth of at the end of the Republic. That already is there in Plato in embryo, but over time you begin to see that the distance between that it become exacerbated. That not only is there a difference between being and becoming, and not only is there a difference between there being sort of perfect and imperfect, then value judgments get laid onto that, where the imperfect is bad, or in some sense one should one should discount it. And this is a thing that happens all over Greek philosophy, whether it's the Neoplatonists, like I mentioned with Plotinus, who again was ashamed to have a body, but even you read it in someone like Marcus Aurelius, where he famously said that he was a corpse carrying around a soul. You have this even in Stoicism, which is ultimately a relatively optimistic vision of reality, a materialist and quite optimistic vision of reality. There's still even a sort of de facto discounting of the physical body and the physical realm, and that sort of becomes pervasive in Greek philosophy. And ultimately, Christianity will take a version of that with them. But you can think of things like the mortification of the flesh in the Catholic tradition that will develop there. But also the big thing that happens, and we're talking about sort of two moments in Greek philosophy. One is a discounting of the physical world and the discounting of the body. So that's one moment that happens in Greek philosophy. The other moment that happens, which is also part of the story, is that increasingly after Plato, and really even before Plato, there is a sense in which the gods need to be rescued from themselves. If you read the stories of the Greek gods, they are not moral exemplars by any stretch of the imagination. They are capricious and jealous and not fair. You can look at the way that the Iliad plays out, where gods and goddesses are just manipulating human beings into massacring each other, and as part of their own grand scheme of things. Zeus is a horrifying, rapine individual. These entities are not moral exemplars. And what we get in Greek philosophy is a sense in which we need to save the gods from themselves. That the gods, in order to be gods, must be good, and therefore
Wow.
these stories need to be dealt with somehow. And we have a long tradition in the Greek world of trying to make the gods good despite the myths. So the gods apparently
Wow! Oh shit.
are not morally good. And I think anyone who's read the Hesiod or Homer can attest to that. And we have this weird thing of trying to rescue the gods. And in some ways, there's basically two mechanisms the ancient Greeks thought to deal with this. One of them was positively horrifying.
Żeby szybko sparafrazować dla osób, które tak szybko nie czytają, albo które gubią się w tym tłumaczeniu, które jest generowane przez sztuczną inteligencję. Generalnie najwyraźniej w jakiś sposób ważne dla naszego dzisiejszego dyskursu o demiurgu jako złej wersji achwistycznego Boga jest fakt, co próbowali zrobić Grecy na pewnym etapie. Najwyraźniej w pewnym momencie skapowali się, że jeżeli religia ma jakoś przywodzić ludziom, to bogowie muszą być wzorem cnót, a nie mogą być tymi krwawymi i pijanymi awanturnikami, jak w greckich mitach. Więc teraz będzie mowa o tym, jak Grecy próbowali właśnie poradzić sobie z tym, że chcemy mieć bogów, którzy powinni być wzorem cnót, ale mamy również nasze własne tradycje i nasze starsze zapisy i nasze starsze mity, pośród których, czy w których nasi bogowie wyglądają jak cholerne skurczybyki. Zastanawiam się, czy zobaczymy pewne paralele i cóż, podobieństwa do tego, i co robi się obecnie z Bogiem starotestamentowym.
And scandalous, and that was Plato's answer. And Plato's answer to deal with the myths was to edit them, was basically to censor them, to take all the elements of
Platon stwierdził, że podoba mi się mina Konora. Nie włączyłem obrazu, więc powiem, co powiedział pan z ezoteryki. Powiedział, że ideą Platona, żeby poradzić sobie z kontrowersyjnymi greckimi mitami, było ocenzurowanie ich. Po prostu wycięcie złych rzeczy i zostawienie tych dobrych. To jest bardzo zabawne i absurdalne, dopóki nie zdamy sobie sprawy, co zrobił Kościół ze składaniem Biblii. Wiecie, zrobił dokładnie to samo, prawda?
of the myths. So one can think of something like Thomas Jefferson's The Life and Moral Teachings of Jesus of Nazareth, where he just goes through with literally a razor blade. It's talking about cutting and pasting. He literally goes through, Jefferson does, and just removes all the miracles and supernatural stuff, harmonizes the Gospels, and we get a sort of a de-supernaturalized version of Jesus. Plato wants to do something very similar with the myths. He says, look, we can't give these myths as they are to our citizens in our Callipolis in the perfect republic. Because they'll emulate the gods. And if they emulate the gods, then they'll think that it's okay to do all this horrible stuff that the gods do. And therefore, what we have to do, as guardians, of course, who know better, we carefully edit the myths to represent the gods as good. So that's one answer to that. And you can imagine how scandalous that must have been in the ancient worlds. Like, you can imagine Socrates has just been executed for aceivia, for impiety. And you can imagine that his chief student comes right after him, and at some point in the middle of his career says, yeah, we should edit the myths because they're morally The conservatives must have been horrified by Plato. And not only that, right? We edit the myths, but also women can be leaders in this republic too. I mean, just a horrifying, scandalous idea of Plato.
Dear, dear.
The other answer to that, right, was the Stoic answer. And the Stoic answer was, we keep the myths, but we read them differently. We say all those sections about the gods, and maybe the myths in general, but certainly those sections about the gods that are scandalous, they're really not about what the gods are doing and who the gods are. Rather, they're metaphors, they're allegories, they're symbolism. And therefore, we rescue the gods not by editing things out like Plato wanted to do, gods forbid, but rather what we do is that we reread them. We
O kurde. O mój Boże. Angole mają takie określenie you can't make this shit up. Po polsku, choćbym próbował, nie wymyśliłbym niczego lepszego. Więc skandaliczny, kontrowersyjny pomysł Platona i jego zwolenników na poradzenie sobie z niemoralnymi bogami z greckiej mitologii był taki, a po prostu je zedytujmy, wytnijmy wszystkie złe rzeczy, zostawmy tylko te dobre. Ale drugi pomysł, który przedstawili stoicy, żeby poradzić sobie z tymi kontrowersyjnymi historiami z greckich mitów, był taki, żeby po prostu zacząć to czytać jako metafory i przenośnie, i alegorie, prawda? No nie powiem, jak co mi to brzmi, nie będę wytykał palcem, ale od tego momentu, kiedy ktoś będzie mi próbował wmawiać, że bardziej kontrowersyjne i dziwniejsze fragmenty Biblii, gdzie na przykład Jahwe ucieka przed odciętym napletkiem Mojżesza, to tak naprawdę alegoria i metafora, to będę pokazywał mu ten materiał i mówił, okej, czyli generalnie jesteś stoikiem w starożytnej Grecji. Rozumiem. No ma to sens. Rzeczywiście wszechmocny Bóg uciekający przed napletkiem, jest to coś dziwnego, może warto by uznać, że to jednak metafora, jeżeli zbyt skandaliczny wydało ci się wycięcie tego fragmentu, twojego ulubionego świętego tekstu. Genialne, po prostu genialne i raz jeszcze mina Alexa jakby mówi wszystko.
ludically
prawda?
reread them and thereby rescue them, because when Zeus transforms into a bull, it's not really him becoming a bull. It's actually representative of some natural force, for instance. And therefore, we rescue the gods hermeneutically. That's what we do. And so there was already in the Greek world, well, hundreds of years before Christianity, probably beginning, our first attested version of this is probably something like the Dervini Papyrus, where we already have a sense that there's a moral idea that the gods need to be good in order to be gods. And therefore the myths themselves.
Okej, czyli ważne w naszej dyskusji o Demiurgu jest to, że już wtedy była idea, przede wszystkim o to chyba chodzi, była idea, bogowie muszą być dobrzy, no bo musimy mieć jakąś podstawę moralności i ochronę przed nieuchronnością śmierci.
Need to be fixed or reread in order to rescue the gods from their own apparent depravity. And already there's an idea that the gods might not be good, and we need to do something with the myths to fix them. And so we have these two strategies, editing, censorship, which never became popular for obvious reasons, and then this hermeneutical trick developed by the Stoics. And we already see that, really early on in the 3rd century, we see that kind of thing developing. And so already, right, there's a sense in which in order to be gods, they must be morally good. The myths depict the gods as not morally good, therefore something needs to be done. And so either there's a shift that has to happen, and already that's happening well before Christianity arrives on the scene.
And still before Christianity arrives on the scene, we'll get to that. Listeners might begin to notice some of the Gnostic Christian themes beginning to emerge about the condemnation of the material world and of the body, and of the sort of weird sense in which there might kind of be like two gods, but not really. It's a bit unclear. We still see this further development from the gods and the sort of demiurge of Plato into a distinctly evil, sort of demonic demiurge creator. Where does this shift happen? Where do we get to something more like like the way people use the term today of demiurge, a sort of evil, malevolent, singular creator, not a linguistic tool to help us sort of escape the trials of the Odyssey and the Iliad, but a theological concept of an evil demiurge?
Yeah, so there's one more sort of step to kind of turn over the engine of the demiurge, and that has to do with the fact that with Hellenism, the Israelites enter the scene, and their god enters into this whole problem, right? What do we do with the gods? And when the Israelites
Pojawia się izraelski Bóg. Nie wiem czemu. To byli Izraelczycy generalnie. Nie wiem czemu.
Like God arrives on the scene, that exact same mechanism is going to be applied to the Israelite God. The Israelite God apparently seems to be morally compromised, and we'll get more into this in a bit. And already we see someone like Philo. Philo of Alexandria famously takes a lot of the material from the Hebrew Bible, which we find morally alarming for, I think, perfectly legitimate reasons. And Philo says, well, let me use this Stoic technique on the Hebrew Bible to basically show that no, the Israelite God is not capricious and not jealous. That's not what's really happening. These are all symbols. And if you've ever read Philo's allegorical commentaries on the Hebrew Bible, which are positively torturous to read, he just goes through and symbolizes everything. They're horrible to read, but he applies a Stoic trick to the Israelite God. But there's a deeper antagonism here, and that deeper antagonism is that when Alexandria is formed as a city in Egypt, about a third of the population are Jews. People often forget
Okej, jesteśmy w Aleksandrii. 1/3 to Żydzi populacji.
that there were more Jews living in Alexandria than there were often living in what became Palestine. So, in terms of Jewish population centers, Alexandria was much more the center of the Jewish world than sort of Judea was, or Israel, or Roman Judea. In fact, Philo of Alexandria, again, one of the most prestigious Jews in ancient history, he only visited the temple once, so far as we can tell. In fact, he never even learned Hebrew. He just admits to him it's a backwater. It's a place that you go for religious reasons, but otherwise it's in the middle of nowhere. Like
Sure.
it's way off there, and he lives in Alexandria, which is not terribly far away. But the idea of having to go way over there, and he's one of the richest Jews in the region. To him, Judea is a backwater, and he's not really that interested in going over there. He sends money, of course, but that's because he'd rather send money than go himself. But Alexandria, in many ways, is a center of the educated Jewish world. This is the world that's producing the Septuagint and many other things. And when the Septuagint's produced, that is to say, the translation of the Hebrew Bible into Greek, there's a kind of PR problem for the Jews living in Alexandria.
Okej, czyli jesteśmy w momencie, kiedy Biblia hebrajska zostaje przetłumaczona na grecki, gdzieś w okolicy Aleksandrii, która jest na tamten moment w zasadzie sercem kultury.
And the PR problem, I think anyone can guess what it is. Central to the Israelite myth is the idea that they were slaves in Egypt, and their God swoops in via Moses, does a great deal of murder and plagues and all that sort of stuff, and then leads them out of Egypt, much to the shame of Pharaoh and the Egyptian gods, who are apparently defeated by this Israelite God. And again, you have to imagine that in many ways in the ancient mind, this is sort of my dad can beat up your dad kind of mentality. And if central to the Israelite myth is...
Okej, więc Izraelici, Żydzi są w Aleksandrii, ale Aleksandria jest w Egipcie, i powstaje przekład z hebrajskiego Biblii. Ale przecież w Biblii jest przypowieść o tym, że kiedyś tam tutaj byli wszyscy w niewoli, prawda, wyznawcy tego Boga, ale zostali przez Boga wypuszczeni, czyli ich Bóg pobił tutejszych bogów, no bo pobił tych egipskich bogów. Pamiętamy wszyscy sztuczki magiczne sług Faraona i sztuczki magiczne Mojżesza, któremu przywodził Bóg Jahwe, a tam byli bogowie egipscy. Czyli mamy problem PR-owy. Prawda? Mamy Żydów w Aleksandrii, w Egipcie, którzy mają swoją świętą książkę, w której jest napisane, że nasz Bóg jest lepszy od waszych bogów, ponieważ nas wyprowadził z Egiptu, kiedy byliśmy tu w niewoli, i jest o wiele potężniejszy.
Yahweh defeating the Egyptian pantheon, and we have a situation where that literature is translated out of Hebrew into Greek. And to make matters worse, we have an example of a character named Ezekiel the Tragedian, who translates not only the Greek into, not only from Hebrew to Greek, but he translates the Greek into theater. This is a thing that can be performed now. So I want you to put yourself into the position of an Egyptian. An average Egyptian, the Egyptian priesthood, which has been there for thousands of years, they've been invaded by the Greeks. They're invaded by the Romans. They're being actively colonized. And in your most prestigious city, there's a group of people who are literally staging plays in which your gods, which are, again, thousands of years old, are being put to shame by foreigners, basically. You can imagine the Egyptian conservatives, the Egyptian religious conservatives, looking at the performance of this idea that their God and their kings are just like nothing compared to a foreign God, again, who are actively being colonized by the Greeks and the Romans. This is simply not going to fly. And the Egyptians have a solution for this. The Egyptians go back to their traditional religion, and in that traditional religion, they have a God. And that God, Seth, that God is associated with foreigners, with the desert, with chaos, with all the kind of things that we think of as typically sort of a relatively malevolent God. This is the God that contests with forests traditionally and things like this. And also this God, Seth, has been traditionally associated with Baal, the storm god of Canaan, of Canaan. And the Egyptians make the make the logical move. Your God is not a good God. Your God is a malevolent desert foreign God.
O,
And not only that, you didn't escape from Egypt. Your God did not take you out of Egypt. We kicked you out of Egypt because you were a bunch of lepers. We quarantined you into the desert, and your God led you into the desert to die. And so the Egyptians make this theological move where Yahweh is identified with their God Set as part of this religious polemic that's developing. And so already the machinery, this is hundreds of years before Christianity.
czyli mamy maszynerię polityczno-religijną, w której Egipcjanie wierzący w wiarę Egiptu na tamten moment mówią, że Żydzi wcale nie mają swojego Jahwe, tylko ten Jahwe to jest tak naprawdę egipski Bóg, zły Bóg, a przynajmniej Bóg kojarzony z rzeczami raczej odstręczającymi Set. I to Set wyprowadził Żydów z Egiptu, ale nie wyprowadził, tylko jakby zwiódł ich na pustynię, żeby tam umierali, bo Egipcjanie tak naprawdę to Żydów chcieli się z Egiptu pozbyć. I jeden Bóg z ich panteonu ich wygnał po prostu na tą pustynię. No, muszę powiedzieć, że jestem pod wrażeniem tego ruchu polityczno-religijnego. I tutaj rzeczywiście możemy zacząć już obserwować jakby genezę Demiurga, prawda? Set, zły Bóg chrześcijan, znaczy Boże, jakich chrześcijan? Zły Bóg Izraelitów, zły Bóg Żydów. Ciekawe, bardzo ciekawe. Świetny manewr, interesujący manewr. Tak zerkam sobie na czat od czasu do czasu. Tak, oczywiście, że Żydów nigdy nie było w Egipcie w takiej liczbie, nie było żadnego eksodusu, ale to pomijamy, prawda? I tutaj rozmawiamy o tym, skąd się wziął Demiurg jako koncept. Trzeba będzie zrobić stream też o historii Jahwe. Koniecznie trzeba będzie zrobić stream.
Christianity will be on the scene. The machinery, the theological machinery is already turning such that Yahweh in the Egyptian mind is identified with this deity Set, and that deity represents foreigners, chaos, the desert, and ostensibly evil. And so Yahweh in the Egyptian mind has now become a malevolent deity. And you can imagine why. All they do is look at the story. Your deity plunged us into darkness and made the Nile, blood and murdered these firstborn children, had nothing to do with this. Your God made Pharaoh's heart hard and made him unable to capitulate. Your God's malevolent. Your God is Seth. And that's a big theological move. And
Wspaniałe, tak. Tutaj szybko zostały wtrącone, tak, zatrzymajmy się na tym chociaż na momencik. Zostały wtrącone fragmenty z Eksodusu, z historii ucieczki Żydów z Egiptu i zostały wskazane okropne rzeczy, które Jahwe, tudzież Set, w tym Egipcie zrobił. No mamy plagi egipskie, mamy Nil, który wylał krwią, mamy śmierć pierworodnych dzieci. To, że Jahwe uwielbia zabijać pierworodne dzieci, to już wiemy, ale dla Egipcjan, najwyraźniej dla starożytnych Egipcjan nawet to było trochę posrane. Mamy też oczywiście tą słynną przypowieść, będącą częścią historii o Eksodusie, w której Mojżesz idzie poprosić Faraona, żeby wypuścił go i Żydów z Egiptu, ale Jahwe przychodzi i specjalnie utwardza serce Faraona, odbierając mu wolną wolę i nie pozwalając Faraonowi umożliwić wyjście Żydów z Egiptu. Więc Jahwe robi po prostu manewry dziwaczne w tej przypowieści i to nie jest przypowieść zmanipulowana przez Egipcjan, przypomnijmy, to jest oryginalna przypowieść zakodowana w Biblii. Jak widzimy, nawet w dawnych, starodawnych przekładach, czy to greckich, czy nawet w oryginale po hebrajsku. No, ja się nie dziwię. I tak samo nie dziwili się przyszli wyznawcy gnostycy, którzy stworzyli z tego demiurga, do czego już chyba niebawem przejdziemy.
See, Gnosticism, whatever that is, this malevolent demiurge tradition is going to originate primarily in Alexandria, it seems like, so far as we can tell. And I think that's completely unsurprising, considering that several hundred years prior to the rise of Christianity, in the Egyptian mind, Yahweh has already become identified as a malevolent god, the Egyptian god Seth.
I should say, by the way, that you lay this out and discuss this in that series I mentioned that you're producing on your YouTube channel, Esoterica, on the Demiurge. Just phenomenal viewing. Just I'm excited.
I by the way, to jest też, to się wspaniale łączy, prawda? Żydzi w Aleksandrii też już próbowali coś z tym fantem robić. Tudzież Grecy, prawda, czy nawet no, Egipcjanie zrobili z niego złego Boga, tak? Ale było mówione, wcześniej ezoterika wspominał, że były też próby przeklejenia jakby tych dwóch idei ze starożytnej Grecji na poradzenie sobie z mitologicznymi opowieściami o Jahwe, tak? Czyli ewentualnie ocenzurowanie ich albo zamienienie tego wszystkiego w symbole. I nawet był wspomniany, nie pamiętam teraz imienia tego filozofa, o którym wspomniał ezoterika, więc możecie sobie ten materiał odtworzyć i znaleźć, który zrobił to, czyli w sensie całą Biblię zamienił w zbiór metafor i symboli, po to, żeby pouzasadniać i trochę no jakby odciążyć Boga Jahwe z tych wszystkich okropnych rzeczy, które robi w Starym Testamencie. No ale Egipcjanie stwierdzili, że dla nich bardziej korzystne będzie, no nie, właśnie wręcz podkręćmy to, w ten sposób uchronimy nasz panteon przed wpływem Jahwe, jesteśmy kolonizowani, musimy się bronić. I konserwatyści egipscy stwierdzili, nie, po prostu wasz Bóg jest zły do szpiku kości i to nie jest żaden wasz Bóg Jahwe, który istnieje gdzieś niezależnie od naszego panteonu. Nie, on jest częścią naszego panteonu, to Set, Bóg chaosu, Bóg obcych. Dlatego wygnał was na pustynię. Jest zły. No, czy można się im dziwić?
As I possibly could be for the next installment. It's wonderful. I'd recommend that anybody who is having their interest speak here go
Nie no, Żyd jest określeniem kulturowym. Nie ma, jest absolutnie neutralny. Przynajmniej w tym kontekście, w którym tutaj mówimy.
and check that out. And what really began to click for me was this
Fascynującym. Ta historia,
history of the Exodus,
fascynująca.
thinking about what it would mean to have these stories circulating. You know, the Jews say, "Our God saved us from Egypt. Our God just came in and just took us, and we just won." And yeah, that is pretty surprising. And I thought, oh, okay, I can see why at least the Egyptians would begin to see this Yahweh, that's our old friend Yahweh again, as, you know, there's something sort of dodgy about him. But when you specifically point out that in the Greek pantheon, they have this god, Seth, who is the god.
Greckim
And I
czy
remember you
chyba
were saying in this video, you say
egipskim?
he's the god of
Chyba się pomyliłem.
disorder. Ah, he's the god of the desert. Okay, he's a god of chaos. Yeah, and a god of foreigners. It all just sort of fell into place.
And
You begin
storms.
to see that, and storms.
Yeah, and storms. Yeah.
And listeners may remember that we talked about sort of, you know, the amalgamation of gods a bit in our previous episode, and how we get from our sort of desert storm god to Yahweh in the Jewish tradition itself. But here again, we've kind of got something like that going on. Listeners might remember that this Yahweh god is a sort of storm god. It has similar connotations, and so it's so easy to see how in the Egyptian tradition, in the same way that a Christian may look at another religion's gods and say, oh, they're actually demons.
Mhm.
You know, oh, that God that you believe in, oh, that's actually the devil. You know, you just don't recognize it. These Egyptians are looking at the Jewish God and saying, oh, that Yahweh, that God that you have, that's actually just Seth. You just don't realize it. And so this seems to be what our sort of first historical indication of a
Fascynujące.
precise identification of Yahweh with a sort of evil God. Obviously, the Egyptians aren't going to believe that Yahweh is the kind of creative power behind the universe, but we've got this like demonization of Yahweh beginning to occur.
Yeah, that's one of the big theological shifts, and again that began all the way back with the Hyksos, right? You talk about when the Hyksos, the Asiatic peoples, invaded Egypt. They were Baal worshippers, at least to some degree, and the major Ramsayums, the major areas where Seth was venerated. And again, we should also say that Seth, the history of Seth is quite complicated, and I have a whole video about the development of Seth as a deity. But already Seth and Baal were linked, and from the Egyptian point of view, Baal and Yahweh are just the same. That, you know, for the Israelites, you know, this is what Ford will call the narcissism of minor difference. That, you know, no one from your point of view, if they're, you know, if they're two different people of one nationality living in the same neighborhood, they couldn't be more different from each other. But from, you know, 3 streets over, you know, the Italians think all the English are the same. But if they're two Englishmen living on the same street, and one's from Manchester, one's from London, they couldn't think of themselves as more different. But from the Italian guy living down the street, it's just English. Well, the same is true for the Egyptians. The Canaanite gods are all basically the same. Baal and Yahweh are just the same deity. But for the Israelites, that's a horrible idea, because they're building Yahweh as a contrast, a competitor to Yahweh. And what we see in the Egyptian literature going all the way back to the Hyksos, basically, is that they've already included Yahweh in some sense in their pantheon. It's not to say that Yahweh isn't real. They never make that move. But they just say, yeah, Yahweh and Baal are the same. And then we get this Yahweh story and Ezekiel the tragedian. And they look at this and go, yeah, your God is a desert, storm, foreign God. But Seth, we already have your God.
You said all the way back in the Hyksos.
Mhm.
What's that?
So the Hyksos were Asiatic peoples that invaded Egypt and ultimately became pharaohs. I mean, they're Hyksos pharaohs. The Ramses were Hyksos. So again, we think of the Egyptians as sort of quite stable place, and in many ways it was culturally stable. But there were definitely periods in which there were Nubian pharaohs, where Nubians had invaded Egypt, and there were Hyksos invaders, and those Hyksos people are people coming in from what we would now consider Canaan, or Israel Palestine now, and they invaded and were able to take political power for a period of time, and they brought their gods with them, and Baal was one of them. And we see again representations of Baal in Ramside temples, and Baal is represented as with the Seth head, this sort of we have this. Most people know that the Egyptian deities would often have animal-headed gods, and many of those are immediately recognizable. The falcon-headed god or the jackal-headed god. But Seth has a strange animal that no one's been able to quite identify, and to this day we call it the Seth beast. It sort of looks like an anteater or something, but no one's quite sure what it is, and eventually it becomes a donkey, as we'll talk about. And that idea of a donkey-headed god is going to become a big deal when we get to the demonization of Yahweh, and even one of the first depictions of the crucifixion carries this donkey-headed. Your God is really Seth business to a one might say a blasphemous depiction of the crucifixion.
Bluźnierstwo, no.
Yeah, it is an interesting tidbit of this entire Yahweh and Demiurge story that you have these strange ancient artistic depictions of Yahweh with a donkey for a head. It seems very strange to suggest. I mean, maybe people just see donkeys as a bit stupid and they're trying to mock Yahweh, and so they give him a donkey head. But when you realize that the Egyptian god Seth has something like a donkey for a head traditionally, and we're sort of talking about this amalgamation of gods, it begins to look like more than just an arbitrary attempt at making fun of the Jewish god, and instead a quite purposeful theological mockery, or a quite purposeful theological statement, observation, argument, right? And so what's kind of going on here with the donkey-headed god? And does this crop up before? I mean, we'll talk about the famous Christian Alexamenos graffiti and whatnot. But does this donkey-headed god, as applied to the Jewish god, appear before the development of Christianity?
It does. It does. So the idea that, again, Seth is depicted as a strange animal, but by Hellenistic times, that strange animal has become basically sort of fossilized as a donkey-headed deity. And again, if Seth and Yahweh are the same deity in the Egyptian mind, then Yahweh is going to be a donkey-headed deity, because Seth and Yahweh are the same thing. And if the Egyptians want to depict Yahweh, they'll depict him as donkey-headed. And then what ends up developing is that this slur against the Judean god, and the Judean god was always, Judaism and the Judean god were always thought of by the Romans, especially, as an unusual group. The Romans, in some sense, always thought of Judaism as an unusual, strange religion, because everything about the Jewish theology didn't match, in some sense, to the Roman theology. The Jewish god was invisible, and the Roman gods were visible. The Jewish god could only be worshipped in one place, whereas the Roman gods could have shrines all over. There are all kinds of things that there was just one of these gods, and the Romans thought this was a very unusual idea, that there would just be one of them. But the Romans, for their point, they had to accept the Jewish religion at some level because it was ancient. For the Romans, what mattered was that your religion was old. It didn't matter that your religion was weird. As long as your religion was old, then they basically accepted that it was true to some degree. But because there was this sense that the Jewish religion was unusual, and also because there was some sense in which they just couldn't imagine that there just wasn't a physical representation of their God, well, the god had to have some appearance. And what it ultimately ends up getting sort of passed around, whether it's through various historiographers or various playwrights and things like this, is the idea is that the Jews are worshiping a donkey-headed god. And you see this over and over and over again, even by Roman historians that probably knew better, that they had known that the Jews worshipped an invisible god. But again, the Jews in the Roman Empire weren't exactly the Romans' most favorite people. This is a cantankerous, rebellious people with an unusual theology. And so if the Romans wanted a good excuse to mock them, then this was a great way. And again, the donkey was thought of in antiquity a bit like donkeys are thought of now, which is deeply unfortunate for donkeys. They're thought of as stupid. They're thought of as sort of dangerous and violent. They're thought of as extraordinarily virile, but also sterile, that they have these enormous penises, but also they can't generate children. And so it's a great way of calling someone a donkey was a bit of a way of making fun of them. And this is sort of the lampooning of the Jewish religion.
Dobra, no tutaj całe te 15 minut sprowadza się do tego, że ponieważ Jahwe był utożsamiony z Setem, a w którejś tam wersji Set był przedstawiany jako Bóg z głową osła, no to zaczęto mockery, czyli nabijać się z Żydów, pokazując Jahwe jako Boga z głową osła.
Is associating the Jewish deity with a donkey-headed deity, and that, of course, has its origins in the synthesis by the Egyptians of Seth and Yahweh.
Yeah, and it's extraordinary. We'll get on to Christianity promptly, but just because I think it's relevant here for those who aren't aware, when you ask people what they think the earliest depiction of Christ in art that we have is, what might it be? Maybe a painting, maybe some kind of engraving. It turns out that one of the oldest depictions that we have, potentially the oldest depiction of Christ in art that we have available to us, is a bit of graffiti that was discovered in the Palatine Hill in Rome, which depicts a stick man worshipping another stick figure with a donkey for a head. Underneath is written the words, Alexamenos worships his god.
Right.
So presumably making fun of some man called Alexamenos for worshipping a donkey-headed god.
A
When I saw a
crucified
recent...
donkey-headed god.
A
Like, yeah, a
crucified
crucified
donkey.
donkey-headed. Yeah, that's the crucial
Crucially,
part, is that this is
the
a
donkey is
headed
being crucified.
yeah, the donkey-headed man is being crucified, and that clearly tips us off that this is a representation of Christ, who the Roman graffiti artist knows that this person Alexamenos worships as God, and therefore, because this is a Jewish god, they know in order to mock.
Proszę bardzo, to jest odrysowane, to jest oryginalne graffiti. Mam nadzieję, że YouTube tego nie zdejmie. Pierwsze historyczne, najstarsze pokazanie postaci Chrystusa, utożsamianego już z Bogiem ze Starego Testamentu. To jest odrysowane. Alex Akaminos, czy jak to tam, Celebrate, coś tam. Pewnie w starożytnym języku. Wow. To jest dopiero bluźnierstwo. Grubo.
Mock that god, or perhaps just to depict that god. That the appropriate depiction is to depict that crucified god with a donkey head. So yeah, most people I think have never seen this image, but it is. I don't know that it's the oldest depiction of Christ. I think some of the older ones are in the catacombs. In fact, many of the oldest depictions of Christ have him beardless. He doesn't get a beard until a couple centuries into things. He's the beardless shepherd, the youthful beardless shepherd. Which again, we can't imagine a clean-shaven Christ, but early Christians clearly have him as a clean-shaven, youthful shepherd Christ. But that is one of the earliest depictions of the crucifixion, and yeah, we have this depiction of a donkey.
O panie, ciekawostka. Czyli to nie, jednak ten Bóg z głową osła nie jest najwcześniejszą depikcją, pokazaniem Chrystusa, ale są wcześniejsze i te wszystkie wcześniejsze pokazują Chrystusa bez brody, jako ogolonego pasterza. Na czysto ogolonego. To ja się tak tylko dopytuję, to o co chodzi z tym całunem turyńskim? Chyba na całunie turyńskim definitywnie mamy tego takiego klasycznego, średniowiecznego Chrystusa, prawda? Just checking. Oh yeah. Cóż. Tylko wspomnę, że ludzie, którzy żyli najbliżej Chrystusa, którzy przedstawiali go w formie sztuki, wcale nie uważali, że miał brodę. Był ogolony, a na całunie turyńskim ma brodę. Może zapiszę sobie do mojej serii filmów o znakach z nieba, o wielkiej analizie tej książki pełnej tych cudownych stwierdzeń. Dziękuję pięknie Dariuszu za donate'a, jakiego wielkiego. Pięknie dziękuję.
Headed Christ God, which must have been, I think, even for Christians at that time, was doubly alarming, because it was alarming in the sense that, first of all, our God doesn't have a donkey head. How dare you? And also, we don't want to be associated with the Jews either. And so it's a double, like, no, our God's not donkey headed. That's the Jewish God. That's not us anymore. And so it must have been doubly alarming to not only to depict Christ this blasphemous way, but also to still continue, in some sense, linking their religion with Judaism, which by that time Christians were actively distancing themselves for several reasons.
Yeah, it's an extraordinary bit of religious history, and you can still see it today. Well, I don't know if you can see it actually today, because the Palatine Hill Museum is under construction, or at least it was when I was last there relatively recently. So we sort of queued up and paid our 16 euros or whatever it was in the blazing heat to see something which was somehow more offensive than this outright blasphemy, which is a bunch of scaffolding and a sign that says that, you know, you'll have to return in 6 months or whatever. It is amazing how Christians will queue up and pay money to go and see blasphemy, but it's a incredible bit of material, because it's somebody mocking this Alexamenos figure just by depicting the God. It's sort of that idea that the crucified God is such an embarrassment. We forget, because Christianity has become so popular and such a successful myth, that the whole idea of a crucifixion is that it is an embarrassing way to die, is that it is this completely disgraceful, dishonorable way to be put to the death. And as a reminder of that, we see that this is how he is mocked in the ancient world. Interestingly, I think that somewhere nearby, like in a building sort of next door to where the Alexamenos graffito was discovered, there's another bit of graffiti discovered where it says something like Alexamenos is faithful written on a wall somewhere else, as if Alexamenos has sort of responded to this. It's this great mystery, and I've always found it an interesting part of religious history.
No, I totally agree. It's, again, this is the way that people communicated. If you've ever been to Pompeii, you can see dialogues in the graffiti where people are making fun of one another, calling each other names, and I won't repeat it's colorful to say the very least. But yeah, this character Alexamenos is, he would be a great sort of cameo character in a show about ancient Rome where we get a vision about that moment, because I think it would, people know the meme of Leonardo DiCaprio like pointing at the screen. I think all the biblical scholars would, we were like, yeah, there it is, the Alexamenos graffiti.
Yeah. I do think, I thought when I was there, when I was queuing up, right, it took like an hour to get in, and there's people like selling umbrellas because it's so hot, and water, and captive crowd, And I remember thinking to myself, some guy, God knows how long ago, is just sort of sitting around and takes, a rock and just like carves a little drawing into a wall. To think that, this many years later, there'd be a museum built on top of it, and there would be people queuing up, paying money specifically to come and see that little drawing you did on the wall. Man, I'm glad he didn't know, because he probably would have changed what he said. There's something magical about how casual that bit of art probably was, that tells us just where the sort of public perception was at the point. So I think it's a wonderful sort of touchstone here for what we're talking about this image of the donkey-headed Christ. You sort of got Christ, who is the Jewish God, but the Jewish God is kind of thought of by other people as kind of like a donkey-headed God, even though the Jews don't see their God as a donkey-headed. All of this sort of comes together in this Alexamenos graffiti to show us that we've got this really weird sort of hurricane of theological ideas that are centering around this person of Christ in the Christian tradition, which is where I think we should probably turn to next, unless there's anything else that's super significant that happens between what we've been talking about and the life and times of a certain Jesus of Nazareth. Perhaps it's time to introduce him to our story.
Yeah, a very minor character, of course, but yes, Jesus of Nazareth appears on the scene, and of course, following his death and resurrection, he becomes deified, as sometimes that happens to gods or people. They get deified, despite the fact that they've inconveniently died, and Christianity enters into it. And one of the things that I'll say about early Christianity is that we think of them.
Czyli teraz jesteśmy już o wiele później, wyszliśmy z Aleksandrii, jesteśmy już po ukrzyżowaniu Chrystusa, wchodzi chrześcijaństwo, prawda? Czyli z Jezusa jest uczyniony Bóg i rozważamy historię Demiurga od tego punktu.
We think of early Christianity as having a great deal of internal theological unity, because institutional Christianity has a lot of skin in the game of telling us that story, that the Catholic Church has always existed and we've always believed the same thing. And, there's an idea of, it goes all the way back to Peter, and there's a sense of continuity, apostolic continuity, theological continuity. The truth of the matter couldn't be further. That what Christians shared in common basically was that they accepted to some degree that Jesus had come, he had taught something very important, that he had died, at least in some sense, and that he had risen from that death, and that those things together represented something salvific. Now, what that something was, and what any of those things were, that Jesus came into the world, that he was born, that he taught certain kinds of things, that he died, and that he was resurrected, and he eventually ascended into heaven, what any of the details of that, how you cashed out those details, represented dozens of Christianities. And those could run the field.
Dziesiątki odłamów, tak? Nawet we wczesnym średniowieczu mieliśmy generalną zgodę wierzących co do tego, że Jezus przyszedł, nauczał, umarł, zmartwychwstał, został wciągnięty do nieba i że jest w tym element zbawienia dla żyjących obecnie, Savior, tak? Czyli zbawca. Natomiast jeśli chodzi o szczegóły, było o wiele inaczej. Nie było jednej zunifikowanej teorii, jednego zunifikowanego zbioru wierzeń, tylko były dziesiątki odłamy, tak jak powiedział ezoteryka, dziesiątki chrześcijaństw.
An enormous variety. And so I think that it's very important that when we talk about the early Jesus movement, early Christianity, that we don't make the assumption that there's sort of a Christianity, but there is a field of Christianities. And they run the gamut from extraordinarily recognizable as something like proto-Catholicism to something utterly unrecognizable in something like the Pistis Sophia. When you read the Pistis Sophia or the books of View, it's difficult to imagine what kind of Christianity that even is. But Jesus is in the center of it, and he's salvific, and I'm sure if you'd have asked those people what they would have told you Christians. And so it's very important that when we get into this, that these people understood themselves as Christians, no different than the big time people that we think of Tertullian or Irenaeus or whatever. They were all Christians in their own way. But yeah, so to deal with Jesus, we have lots of different theological moves. And I think the really important theological move here is going to be Marcion. Marcion is going to be the character that is going to begin to shift Christianity in this sort of malevolent demiurge direction. And again, that has everything to do with the fact that for basically all philosophical schools at the time of
Marcion.
Christianity, this is a time period that we typically refer to as Middle Platonism,
Marcion będzie istotny.
virtually all schools, with perhaps the exception of Cynics or Epicureans, but basically the general tenor of Greek philosophy at the time was that in order to be a god, you had to be good. That the gods were good. And that in order to be a god, you had to be good. And Christianity is going to inherit the Israelite scriptures. They're going to inherit the Hebrew Bible.
Muszę cofnąć,
And
bo strasznie mnie to interesuje.
virtually schools, and again, that has everything to shift Christianity, and this is going to be Marcion. Marcion is going to be the character that is going
Marcion
to
będzie postacią, która
begin to
rozpocznie
shift
zmianę
Christianity in this sort of
chrześcijaństwa w rodzaju
malevolent demiurge
kierunku
direction.
mrocznego,
And again, that has everything to do with the
złowrogiego
fact
demiurga.
that for basically all philosophical schools at the time of Christianity, this is a time period that we typically refer to as Middle Platonism,
Szkoły filozoficzne czy
virtually all
chrześcijaństwa
schools, with perhaps the exception of Cynics or Epicureans, but basically the general tenor of Greek philosophy at the time was that in order to be a god, you had to be good. That goodness,
Wracamy
the
do
gods
konceptu, że żeby być Bogiem, trzeba być dobry. Nie może być złego Boga.
were good. And that in order to be a god, you had to be good. And Christianity is going to inherit the
No, a chrześcijaństwo dziedziczy Stary Testament, tak. Pisma izraelskie.
Israelite scriptures. They're going to inherit the Hebrew Bible. And so insofar as Christianity is an outgrowth of Judaism, they're going to have to deal with the Hebrew Bible. And as we'll see,
Tak, czyli chrześcijanie muszą sobie poradzić z hebrajską Biblią, o której wiemy, że wcześniej Egipcjanie używali, żeby stworzyć seta, prawda, żeby uzasadnić to wszystko. A to się łączy jeszcze z generalną grecką filozofią, kierunkami filozofii, że generalnie mamy problem, kiedy Bóg w oczywisty sposób jest zły i okrutny i zazdrosny, a Bóg biblijny ze Starego Testamentu uosabia wszystkie te cechy. Nieważne jaką metodę stoicką czy platońską zaaplikujemy, żeby to wyjaśnić i dalej pozostać komfortowo w naszym zestawie wierzeń, że istnieje Jezus, istnieje Bóg i Bóg starotestamentowy, Jezus to jedna i ta sama istota.
for instance, with Marcion, there's a lot of ways of dealing with the Hebrew
Marcion.
Bible, one of which is to demonize it. And that's in some sense exactly what Marcion is going to do.
Yeah, so Marcion provides our first attempt at something of a Christian canon, trying to put these texts together and say, these are the ones that we should follow, these are the ones that we should listen to, much like the church eventually did, giving us the Holy Bible that we have today. Marcion's approach was a little bit different to theirs.
Czyli tak jak Kościół zrobił, kompilując pisma Starego i Nowego Testamentu, wybierając jedno, odrzucając inne teksty, jakby kanonizując różne rzeczy, tworząc kanon biblijny, powybierali sobie te fragmenty, które były właściwe, które składały się na tą jedną spójną wizję, jak gdyby chrześcijańskiego Boga, który pochodzi oczywiście od plemiennego Boga Bóż Jahwe i jest to jedna i ta sama istota. Natomiast Marcion, ten filozof, postarał, czy teolog, uznał, że spróbuje inaczej wyjaśnić Stary Testament wraz z figurą jakby inaczej spróbuje połączyć Stary Testament z postacią Jezusa Chrystusa. Inaczej zaadresuje fakt, że mamy zazdrosnego, okrutnego, biblijnego Jahwe i mamy Chrystusa, który teoretycznie, to są ci sami ludzie, którzy w to wierzą, to są Żydzi, to są Izraelici. Teraz musimy to jakoś połączyć. No to oczywiście Żydzi, potem wyłania się oczywiście chrześcijaństwo, mowa o wczesnych chrześcijaństwach
In
na
part
tamtych ziemiach.
due to its exclusion wholesale of the Hebrew Bible, which should tell us something already. It contains
czyli
one
Marcion
gospel, which
odrzucił w ogóle
is a
hebrajską
sort of
opowieść.
shorter version of Luke, which may be an edited version of Luke, or potentially an early version of Luke, which was expanded upon to give us Luke's gospel, as well as some, but not all, of the letters of Paul. This is the canon that we're given by Marcion, or is suggested used by Marcion. I suppose the question is this: when Marcion is compiling his Christian canon, why does he exclude the Old Testament? What we now call the Old Testament. Why does he exclude the Hebrew Bible altogether?
So yeah, you're right to say, right? We have this text called the Apostolicon. We have the text that is the Pauline letters, and you also have the text called the antitheses. We'll talk about the
Yes.
antitheses in just a minute as well. I think that the reason why Marcion and
Znaczy, saved, jeżeli chodzi o zło Boga, no to oczywiście tutaj zło należy zrobić, wiesz, w nawiasach, z uwagi na to, że oczywiście pamiętamy Williama Lane'a Craiga i ideę, że skoro dobro pochodzi od Jahwe, no to wszystko, co Jahwe robi, jest dobre, prawda? Pamiętamy wszyscy materiał, w których rozmawialiśmy o biblijnych rzeziach i staraliśmy się to jakoś wytłumaczyć, na co stwierdzenie było, że wytłumaczenia nie było, po prostu to było dobre, ponieważ Bóg jest dobry i Bóg nie zleciłby czegoś złego. Natomiast tutaj bardziej saved mowa o tym, jak chrześcijanie próbowali sobie poradzić z tym w ich czasach. Czyli w jaki sposób próbowali sobie poradzić z tym, co im wydawało się złe. No nie istniała jeszcze najwyraźniej teoria świętej moralności, której hołduje William Lane Craig, i próbowali poradzić sobie jakoś inaczej. Inaczej to połączyć, inaczej wytłumaczyć sobie te czyny Jahwe ze Starego Testamentu, które nie twierdzę, że były złe, tylko które totalnie i absolutnie i maksymalnie złe się wydają. Z perspektywy wszystkich, nawet starożytnych uczonych i teologów, prawda? W związku z czym słuchamy teraz o historii Demiurga, jak on się wykształcił na bazie tego rodzaju rozważań i historii Jahwe w zetknięciu z egipskim panteonem za czasów, gdy Aleksandria była stolicą kulturową zarówno Egipcjan, ale również Żydów i tak dalej, i tak dalej. Więc słuchamy historii Demiurga.
folks should know Marcion's living in living in sort of the early 2nd century. He's a shipping magnate. He's quite wealthy, and like every person, if you have a lot of money, well, you have power and prestige. And we should remember at this time, Christianity is not a highly organized religion.
No, saved, ty mówisz, że oni nie są chrześcijanami, a oni mówili, że są. No i trudno, no i mamy problem.
It is a religion basically organized in houses, and even in very powerful places like Rome, Christianity is not a hierarchical system. It is much more distributed, and there are leaders, presbyters they're called at that time, and the Roman presbyters do have some authority, but this is not like the Pope can decree things. That's not until you get to the end of the 2nd century that the Bishop of Rome has the kind of authoritative power to decree things in the way that we think. Maybe even later than the late 2nd century. At any rate, Marcion, I think, just does what any person would do. Marcion's Greek; he's not Jewish, and so he doesn't have any reason. Unlike perhaps someone like Peter or Paul, they're Jews, and when they look at the Hebrew Bible, what we now call the Hebrew Bible, they would have looked at that as part of their history, and therefore they would have had not only a theological, but in some sense even an ethnic, as much as one can separate sort of ethnic identity and theology at that time, which is actually quite difficult to separate in some sense, and in Judaism it's still quite difficult to separate.
Okay, czyli Marcin
But someone
jako
like
Grek nie
Paul
ma
or
takiego
Peter,
przywiązania do Biblii hebrajskiej, jak miał Piotr, Paweł czy
James,
inni.
they would have had a deep-seated idea that the Hebrew Bible, the Hebrew Scriptures, are part of their story and they're part of their ultimate arc of their salvation history. If you're not Jewish and if you're a Greek living way out in the outer reaches of the Roman Empire, Marcion is a Greek living in Pontus, what is on the Black Sea and what is now northern Turkey. He doesn't have any real reason to look at the Hebrew Bible as anything other than a bunch of books. They're just books to him, and they happen to feature the same God that he believes in, perhaps. But in some sense, they're just a collection of myths like all kinds of other myths. And so Marcion can see them in a way that the Jewish followers of Jesus, the early Jesus movement, could not. And Marcion does the most dangerous thing that one can do to any scripture. And the most dangerous thing you can do to any scripture is just read it. It's just read it. There's nothing more disturbing one can do to any scripture than read it. And if you read it and take a look at it and say, rather than doing all this hermeneutical mental gymnastics to rescue the gods, all these mental gymnastics to
Rescue the gods, nawiązanie do tego, co Grecy chcieli zrobić.
make the gods look good, just look at it. And does the story depict a deity that's morally good? And Marcion comes to the conclusion, the eminently reasonable conclusion, that the deity depicted in the Hebrew Bible is not good. And insofar as that deity is not good, perhaps the deity is even malevolent, if the deity is not good, then by definition, then the not goodness of that deity de-deifies them. They're not a deity anymore. Because again,
Ponieważ filozoficznie bogowie muszą być dobrzy, to jeżeli Bóg biblijny jest zły, a z perspektywy wszystkich był, no to mamy problem. W takim razie Bóg z Biblii, przynajmniej ze starych pism hebrajskich, składający się na jakąś tam wersję starożytną Starego Testamentu, nie może być Bogiem.
the Greek imagination, the Greek philosophical idea at the time, goodness renders the deity. Insofar as the deity is not good, they're not a deity. Marcion does this thing. He reads the Hebrew Bible and says, that is not a deity.
Right.
Now, we'll get into what Marcion thought this entity was, but what Marcion does is he develops a third text called the Antitheses, and this is sort of what we call an isagoga, introduction. And he really packaged this as sort of a unit. He really wanted this to be the thing that he put in the hands of all his followers, and ultimately, I think that he did. The Marcionite church lasted for centuries. And the Antitheses, basically, and again, we have to reconstruct it because we don't have it, and we should be very careful that
Yeah, we don't have access to this text.
we don't have it.
do we?
We have fragments quoted by his enemies, so we should always be careful about to what degree we can trust this. But we have good reason to believe that we can reconstruct to some degree the Apostolicon, and we have fragments of the Antitheses. But what he does is he takes the example of Jesus, specifically from his Apostolicon, this version of Luke that he has, and he contrasts Jesus, who he believed was God, with the God of the Hebrew Bible.
Okej, znowu parafrazując, bo te tłumaczenie YouTube'owe nie do końca nadąża. Marcjon stwierdził, że no Bóg biblijny nie może być Bogiem biblijnym, bo Bóg musi być dobry, a Jahwe zdecydowanie dobry nie jest. Ale Marcjon uważał, że Jezus Chrystus, na pewno jest Bogiem. W związku z czym wziął dobrą postać Chrystusa, nowotestamentową, czy w tamtych czasach, no w zasadzie niedawną, figurę historyczną praktycznie, i ją kontrastuje z Jahwe ze Starego Testamentu, pokazując, to nie są te dwa same byty, mało tego, one w sposób oczywisty stoją do siebie w opozycji. Czyli bierze takie tak naprawdę po prostu zwyczajne, literalne odczytanie tekstu biblijnego i czyta sobie, tak jak dzisiaj moglibyśmy przeczytać sobie Stary i Nowy Testament, nawet dzisiaj moglibyśmy przeczytać sobie Nowy i Stary Testament i stwierdzić, no coś tu jest cholera jasna nie tak. No definitywnie nowotestamentowy Jezus, nawet z tego z kanonicznej, prawda, dzisiaj świętej Biblii, zatwierdzonej przez Kościół z pieczątką papieżów, no definitywnie nie pasuje do tego Boga Jahwe. No przeczytaj chociaż trochę tej Biblii. Ja w całości Biblii nie przeczytałem, ale naczytałem się jej bardzo dużo na tym kanale. I muszę powiedzieć, że wow, no jest to sensowny wniosek, zgaduję.
Shows the Hebrew Bible God does X and Jesus does not X. The Hebrew Bible God does Y and Jesus does.
Czy Jezus nie był taki dobry? To tak, wiadomo, no ale weź go popatrz sobie na figurę Chrystusa i na to, co on robił i mówił, do biblijnego Jahwe, to jakby rozumiesz, że kontrast jest absolutnie olbrzymi.
Not Y. And they are theologically opposed, specifically morally opposed. And by
Moralnie
doing this sort of
sprzeczne.
moral opposition, I can give just one example of this. One of the good ones we have is, for instance, in the Exodus, where Yahweh tells the Israelites to basically pillage Egypt on their way out. And that happens in the Hebrew Bible, and there's all kinds of justifications for
No
that.
tak, jak już Żydzi wychodzili z Egiptu, Jahwe powiedział, by the way, okradnijcie tych wszystkich Egipcjan. I bierzemy to jako przykład tego złego aktu biblijnego Boga, czy bardziej teraz Stwórcy.
Pillaging that happened in rabbinical literature. But the Bible just really makes it clear that they're just pillaging on their way out. Well, Yahweh says to pillage. What does Jesus say? Give your money away to the poor.
A Jezus mówi, rozdawajcie pieniądze biednym. No mamy sprzeczność.
Right? Be poor.
Yep.
And so that shows that the same entity cannot be the same entity because they're operating from fundamentally opposed moral positions, and therefore it must be two entities, one of which is good, one of which is malevolent. And Marcion
you give
ultimately concludes
examples in your video on your own channel. You give some more examples of these contrasting attitudes. The law.
Saved. Bardzo się cieszę, że jesteś z nami, ale uwielbiam te twoje komentarze tak wyrzucane po jakimś dużym fragmencie, mówiąc, nie ma żadnego kontrastu. Żadnego. Żaden się nie zorientuje. Żaden.
Of Yahweh saying an eye for an eye, Jesus saying to turn the other cheek, and to forgive your enemies and love your enemies. Yahweh sending bears to avenge the prophet Elisha.
Słynne niedźwiedzie.
Elisha. How do you say it? Elisha?
I think that it depends on people say Elisha, people say Elisha.
Pójdź no łysku. Piękny przykład w Biblii polskiej wersji, prawda? Wszyscy pewnie pamiętamy jeszcze tą słynną historię z Biblii, w której prorok podróżuje sobie między miastami i z pobliskiej wioski, czy z tego miasta za nim wybiega kilkanaścioro dzieci i te dzieci się naśmiewają z naszego proroka, ponieważ najwyraźniej ten prorok łysieje albo był łysy. w polskim przekładzie chyba jest coś w rodzaju pójdź no łysku. Na to prorok się wkurza, modli się do Jahwe, żeby zrobił porządek z tymi dziećmi, na co z lasu wypadają 2 niedźwiedzice i rozszarpują, jeżeli się nie mylę, 42 tych dzieci. Jakby na strzępy. Po prostu rozszarpują je. Nie? I czytasz tą przypowieść biblijną, no i albo robisz stoików, więc to jest symbol i metafora, że że tak naprawdę nie było żadnych niedźwiedzi, które rozszarpały dzieci, tylko naprawdę niedźwiedzie symbolizują agresję natury, która zwraca się przeciwko agresorowi, że jakby natura jest sobie dobra albo neutralna, ale przychodzą te dzieci, które niejako wkraczają, przeprowadzają inwazję w naturę, gdzie tutaj metaforą natury byłaby łysina naszego proroka i przez to niedźwiedzie jakby reprezentują tą naturę, która przychodzi jakby oddać to, wiecie. Musielibyśmy zrobić coś tego rodzaju, żeby pójść za stoikami, czyli jakby zmetaforyzować, znaleźć symbole tej opowieści o rozszarpanych przez niedźwiedzie dzieciach. Moglibyśmy pójść za Platonem, który zasugerował, żeby z mitów greckich po prostu wywalić te fragmenty, no ale z jakiegoś powodu ten fragment Biblii jest. Dalej go można przeczytać, mam Biblię na półce, mogę wam go zaraz znaleźć i przeczytać wam tutaj z Biblii takiej normalnej, niebieskiej za 30 zł z Allegro. Jest to napisane, prawda, w tej Biblii. I jakby Marcjon spojrzał na to i powiedział, no nie da się. Nie da się. Jezus, który umarł za grzechy ludzkości na krzyżu, który mówił, by miłować swojego wroga tak jak bliźniego swego, by nadstawiać drugi policzek, by kochać, by obejmować swoich oprawców, kontra Jahwe, który mówi, dobra dzieciaki, koniec kurde zabawy. To jest mój prorok i wy nie będziecie mi tutaj mojego proroka obrażać. Niedźwiedzice. Wiecie, co do was należy, prawda? Więc mamy problem. No tak, patrzeć na kontekst, no właśnie, czyli Saved proponuje, że oczywiście na tą przypowieść o niedźwiedziach trzeba patrzeć przez kontekst historyczny, kontekst tego, że to były prawdopodobnie pewne przypowieści pisane przez ludzi z tamtego okresu, że prawdopodobnie to się wcale nie wydarzyło, tylko miało znaczenie symboliczne, etc., etc. Czyli robisz stoików. To jest okej. Chodzi tylko o to, że... I to jest okej. Masz prawo to zrobić, saved, oczywiście, tutaj na czacie, ale rozumiesz, że dla innych to może być trudne do zaakceptowania obie te rzeczy naraz. Jezus i Jahwe, który wysyła niedźwiedzie, żeby zabiły dzieci. Prawda? No jest to dziwne.
In Hebrew, it's whatever. It's like, is the proper pronunciation Elijah? And I'm like, well, in Hebrew, it's Eliyahu. So, but
Let's
Elisha.
go with Elisha.
Yeah,
Alex,
Elisha.
well, okay, let's go with Elisha. Let's go with Elisha. The Creator, Yahweh, sends bears to avenge the prophet Elisha after being mocked.
Right.
Whereas it's just something you sort of can't imagine Jesus doing. The Yahweh allows Moses to drop the Red Sea onto the Egyptians, killing them, drowning them, which, again, it's sort of difficult to imagine Jesus doing. Jesus, the figure of sacrifice for all mankind, coming to redeem sinners, sort of imagining the same kind of being, sort of turning around and drowning the Egyptians in some sort of vengeful wrath.
Jezus tak idzie poświęcić się na krzyżu, oprawcy i tak dalej, kocham was i tak dalej. Ojcze, przebacz im, bo nie wiedzą, co czynią. Kontra Jahwe, który po prostu rozstępuje Morze Czerwone. Egipcjanie wchodzą tam z całą armią, goniąc Żydów i wtedy Jahwe mówi jeb! I te morze zamyka się i zmorduje efektywnie setki, jeżeli nie tysiące ludzi, prawda? No, ciężko sobie wyobrazić, żeby to była jedna i ta sama istota, która robi obie te czynności.
Presumably Yahweh didn't have to do that to get the Israelites to escape. Who knows?
The hardening of the heart.
It's certainly difficult. The hardening of the heart, of course.
Yeah.
Like Pharaoh's. This was one of my first objections. I remember when I was a child at school. I remember specifically asking about Pharaoh's hardened heart.
Mm-hmm.
If God hardens Pharaoh's heart, how can Pharaoh then be judged for having a hardened heart? It's just not the kind of behavior that you can see Jesus partaking in. And as you say in your video, even people today who maybe aren't aware of the ideas that we're discussing, will still look at the Christian story and still talk about the Old Testament God as if it's like a different character. You know, like Richard Dawkins famously, the God of the Old Testament is the most whatever, you know, vindictive character in all of fiction, or whatever it is that he says. People talk about the God of the Old Testament, and you sort of describe this as a kind of like neo-Marcionism, even if people don't realize they're doing what Marcion did, which is looked at this character and thought, there's just something about this God which makes me unable to identify with Jesus. Even like the critics, even the Christian critics who are trying to say that they don't believe it or they think it's evil or whatever, they still, even just in terms of like characters in a fictional story, feel the need to separate these two beings as different characters. So what Marcion was doing there seems to be pretty reasonable.
I would say it's eminently reasonable. I'd also say that the vision of Jesus as sort of kumbaya, hippie, lovey-dovey Jesus also is a misreading of the Gospels. Jesus also says things like, I didn't come to bring peace to the world, but I came to bring a sword. And if you love your father and mother, then you don't love me. And Jesus also says some pretty extreme things in the New Testament. So they're both examples of selective reading, right? You can read all the evil stuff about Yahweh, and certainly it's there. And we can read all the kumbaya stuff about Jesus, and that's certainly there. But also, there's also great stuff about Yahweh, about him being compassionate and loving and kind. And there's also sections where Jesus is quite violent in his, in the way that he is in the world. He's quite conservative. We think of Jesus as being a liberal in some sense, but Jesus, the few times that Jesus gives Jewish legal rulings, what we call halakha, they're more conservative than any other rabbi of his time. So in many ways, he was not at all liberal. He was extremely conservative, maybe even xenophobic. We have this great line where the Samaritan woman comes to ask him for a miracle, and Jesus says, "No, I'm not going to deal with you. You're Samaritan." And she says, "Well, sometimes crumbs fall off the table, and we can eat the crumbs that fall from your table." And Jesus says, "You can have the crumbs." And I'm like, it's a very xenophobic kind of Jesus. So I think that the neo-Marcionism that some Christians ultimately adopt is also born of the fact that they don't read the New Testament either. They're reading a certain kind of hippie liberal Jesus, which I think is not there in many ways. But for sure, I would say that many Christians come to a very reasonable conclusion once they actually do the dreadful thing of reading the Bible. Famously, Voltaire said the Bible is more celebrated than known. And I think that's true. No one reads the damn thing hardly. And I think when you read it, and if you read it without jumping through the mental gymnastics of trying to rescue this God, or you read it as just a collection of Israelite literature, no different than Assyrian literature or Babylonian literature, it's hard to look at that God and think, this is a loving, caring, good entity. This is an entity that seems to be jealous and capricious, and God changes God's mind. Yahweh changes Yahweh's mind at some point. Yahweh repents of things. Yahweh wants to just kill all the Israelites, and Moses is like, not so fast. And Yahweh's like, yeah, you're right. I'm sorry. Like you get this completely different vision of this entity. And Marcion just he makes a logical conclusion and says, there are two gods here. Or rather, I should say, one of these is not a god. Yahweh is in fact not a god. It's a really important. Yahweh, or rather, Marcion was accused by his critics of being bitheistic, which is to say he believed in two gods. And polytheism was a pretty common thing to hurl at your opponents. Polytheism being the most laughable idea for the Christians, which is a bit laughable considering they invented the Trinity and they're surrounded by polytheists. Again, you point a finger and many point back at you. Again, it's a bit rich when they're accusing other people of polytheism. But one of the things that Tertullian and other people would do is accuse Marcion of bitheism and therefore polytheism. It's very clear if we read what we have of Marcion, he rejected the idea that Yahweh was a god. Again, because of the moral failures of this entity. But what he does argue, and this is mostly coming out of Paul's letters, is that Yahweh is responsible for the creation of this world. And in that sense, Yahweh is in control. Sometimes Marcion calls Yahweh the cosmocrator, the world ruler. And what you get in some of Paul's letters, which again, most people don't read them very carefully, you do get the weird, from time to time, Paul saying things like the ruler of this world. And you're like, who is he talking about? And many Christians say, he's talking about the devil. That the devil's sort of in control of this world to some degree, which is a theologically unusual position in some senses. Marcion just says, yeah, the one that made this into
Czyli Demiurg stworzył... Okej, chyba już wiem, do czego to dąży. Demiurg to starotestamentowy Bóg, który stworzył ten straszliwy, pełen zemsty, nieszczęścia i śmierci świat, a Jezus to nasz Mesjasz, który ma nas uwolnić od starotestamentowego potwora.
World is in charge of it, and that's not Christ. Christ came here to undermine that deity, and Marcion's creator being, the malevolent Demiurge, who will become the Demiurge, that entity was ultimately responsible in his stupidity for trying to murder Jesus, thinking that he could basically murder God, and that didn't work, because Christ wasn't a man.
Od Demiurga Platona, który był neutralnym aspektem, który brał formy idealne i nakładał je na nieidealną materię. Jesteśmy wiele, wiele lat później i mamy wczesnochrześcijański gnostyczny odłam, który próbuje pogodzić Stary i Nowy Testament. Fascynujące.
And he was God. And so what you get is that shift. And so, yes, Marcion did not believe in two gods. What he did believe is that the entity described in the Hebrew Bible is responsible for creation, but ultimately is not a god. Now, there's a lot of questions lingering there, and we'll see how those get fleshed out in just a moment.
Yeah. So crucially now, we've got a similar story of Marcion looking at this God, Yahweh, this character, and thinking, no, this is some kind of evil, malevolent deity, a bit like the Egyptians kind of did, and when they identified it with Seth. But Marcion is a Christian. He believes in Christ. And in Paul's letters, it's quite clear that this Old Testament, this law, this Hebrew Bible is like relevant. There's something about it. There's something going on. Jesus is quoting the scriptures. Like you can't just sort of throw it out entirely. You have to offer some account of what's going on there. And so we have the first maybe fleshed out account here of a belief that Yahweh is this evil type demiurge creator of the universe, but not in such a way as to just like discount his theological significance or to amalgamate him into your own pantheon, but in a specifically Christian context where we finally end up with this idea of Jesus as God coming from the true divine realm and Yahweh as this demiurgic creator, I suppose.
Right.
I think we might have spoken before in our last episode about how for Orthodox Christians, Yahweh eventually becomes Christ, whereas for the Gnostics, Yahweh eventually becomes the demiurge. And we're exploring this second option here. And as you say, Marcion was quite popular. Marcion's followers, Marcionite churches existed until perhaps the mid 400s of the Common Era, I think.
It's the last time they're mentioned. I mean, that's the last time that they're basically one of them burns down. There's a Marcionite church next to an Orthodox church, and the Marcionite church burns down, and there's a mention of the fact that it was being repaired. But no, it was popular enough
could
that
be even later.
Yeah, it could be. I think it was much later. I think that there's examples where some of the Christians, Orthodox Christians, so-called Orthodox Christians, would say things like, if you go to a new city, make sure you ask for a Catholic church, because if you just ask for a church, you're just as likely to end up in a Marcionite church. And so there's,
that, by the way, is like one of my favorite facts. It was first Elaine Pagels who brought my attention to it, and then I couldn't remember who it was that said this. In your video, you say it's Cyril of Jerusalem.
Cyril of Jerusalem, yeah.
Cyril of Jerusalem is warning Christians in the early church when they go to a new church to specifically ask for a Catholic church rather than a Christian church, because if they ask for a Christian church, they might be sent to this Gnostic Marcionite community.
Right.
When people say to me, Alex, you're kind of becoming a bit obsessed with the Gnostics. And yeah, I am. I mean, I think it's interesting. But they say, this was just some silly little fringe movement at the beginning of the Christian church. It was basically immediately condemned. It's like, then why were Christians being warned in this way?
Yeah.
That's why it's one of my favorite facts to point out that it was maybe a bit more popular than people give it credit for.
No, in fact, it was so not only popular, because we have good examples of Marcionite churches lasting for centuries, but it was clear that Cyril of Jerusalem has to issue this warning because an average believer wouldn't know the difference. I think that's the part that I think flies under the radar. It's not just that they would end up in a Marcionite church, but that they wouldn't even know the difference. That they need to be directed to the so-called Catholic Church, because for them they would just be church. And I think that's so crucially important. When we call these people Valentinians or Marcionites or whatever, we're allowing their enemies who intentionally named their beliefs after their so-called founders to oppose them to Christianity. You're not a Christian, you're a Marcionite. You're not a Christian, you're a Valentinian. If you went to a Marcionite church, if you went to a Valentinian church and asked them what they were, they would just tell you they were a Christian.
Right.
We don't call Catholicism Irenaeanism. We don't call it Tertullianism. I sometimes want to do that. I'm like, there's Marcionism and there's Irenaeanism. And where's Christianity? It's all Christianity. But we shouldn't when we do this whole, there were Marcionites, I'm like, well, we don't refer to Irenaeanites, but I think we could, and we should perhaps. It'd be a bit in the mouth, but you can see the point. But I think that's the other point too, is that the average believer wouldn't have known they were in a Catholic or Marcionite church. It probably was all the same to them. They had to be shepherded into the right place. And I think to this day, I think that people are very cozy with Marcionism. And as I mentioned in the video, when you brought up just a moment, I think most people are Marcionites. If you really got into asking them, what do you think about this Old Testament God? They're going to do some kind of hand wringing. But their first answer is, that God, the God that delights in the children's head being bashed against rocks, which the Bible says that. What a horrifying idea that this Yahweh God delights in the murder of children. It's really hard to square that with the Jesus that people want. That's not to say that Jesus is actually there in the Gospels, and the immediate, I think, response will be a kind of low key Marcionism, and I think that's endemic. I grew up with Christians all the time with sort of low key Marcionism. Or they'll say something like, well, that's God the Father, and God the Father is really strict, and Jesus is really a bit more loving and kind. I'm like, you're real close. Like,
He's like the cool, rebellious son.
yeah, with the leather jacket, and he's like, listen to the cool music, and mean old grumpy dad is, he's the one that
Yeah.
hardened Pharaoh's heart. Yeah, I'm like, you would have ended up in a Marcionite church and not known the difference.
Yeah, but they're also going to point to the fact that Jesus says that he's there not to abolish the law, but to fulfill the law. Not until if a single jot or tittle is struck from the law, then that person is condemned, and all of this kind of stuff. So I mean, where does that fit into a Christian demiurgic Gnostic community, where Jesus is clearly quoted in at least some instances of being the fulfillment?
Znowu YouTube trochę nie nadąża z tłumaczeniem. Chodzi o to, że w Biblii jest również napisane, że Jezus powiedział, że nie przyszedł zmienić prawa, jeno je wypełnić i że trzeba przestrzegać wszystkich 613 przykazań starotestamentowych. I Alex teraz pyta, no to jakby to chyba wskazuje, że jednak Jahwe Jezus to ta sama istota.
Of what's sort of promised in the Old Testament.
And I think that's in Matthew, and I think that's in Matthew, and I'm pretty sure that's part of the reason why
Marcion
not rejected
in his canon.
Yeah, he's certainly much more comfortable with Luke, because Luke is a bit more of a Greek. The Greek of Luke is a bit nicer. It's a bit better written. It's clearly written in Greek originally, unlike Mark and Matthew, which may have had Aramaic originals. It's less Jewish. I mean, in so many ways, Luke is Matthew is quite Jewish, even though it has this. And also, Luke has these moments where the Jews, again, we can think of all the damage this has done through history, but we shouldn't put, anti-Semitism into the mouth of Marcion. But it is this idea that in Luke, you have the idea that the Jews are from the very beginning, hoyahudoi, like they are conspiring to kill Jesus from the very beginning. And Marcion's story is the malevolent creator of the world is manipulating his people, the Jews, who at that point were the enemies of Christianity in some degree, to murder Jesus in the hopes of basically killing God. And we have the origins of this sort of theocide myth and the Jews as a corporate entity, which also occurs, unfortunately, in Matthew as well. But I think that those kinds of Jewish-Christian polemics, Marcion is also instrumentalizing them and saying, not only does Christianity supersede Judaism, it is in fact inherently opposed to Judaism. Judaism is a religion of law and death, whereas Christianity is a religion of life and salvation. And those kinds of juxtapositions you still hear in the mouth of some Christians in a sort of anti-Semitic way, but also just normative supersessionist theology relies on that kind of logic, which is, of course, deeply pioneered by.
Albo jest też ta logika, że jakby Stary Testament się dokonał, jakby tamta wersja Boga jakby się dokonała i Jezus przyszedł odrodzić tą religię w nowym, tym dobrym, moralnym wydaniu. To się też często słyszy, prawda, z ust apologetów, że Stary Testament historycznie został wypełniony, prawo się wypełniło i Chrystus przyniósł nowe, lepsze, czystsze, moralniej prawo.
By Marcion.
Yeah, because this demonized demiurge god is this adapted vision of Yahweh, and Yahweh is the God of the Jews, you do have these themes running throughout a lot of this demiurgic thinking that the Jews are like the chosen people of the demiurge, of the malevolent, evil creator. They are his handymen. And there is a particular passage in John chapter 8, which is relevant here. In John chapter 8, verse 44, Jesus has sort of been arguing with the Jews. And when sort of Jesus implies that they don't have the same father, weirdly, and the Jews say to him, what are you talking about? We're both from Abraham. We both share a father. We're not illegitimate children. To which Jesus says in verse 44, you belong to your father, the devil, and you want to carry out your father's desires. He was a murderer from the beginning, not holding to truth, and so on and so forth. You belong to your father, the devil. If you read any translation of the New Testament, you're likely to come across this passage. You belong to your father, the devil. But another thing that I learned from your video, which again just completely fascinated and astounded me, and I had to think about it for a really long time, was that might be possibly a mistranslation.
Yeah, to frame this, this whole debate between Jesus and the Jews and John, it's sort of the end result of a long development within Christianity. Whereas in the early Gospels, like Mark, Jesus is arguing, but he's arguing with the scribes and the Pharisees. So it's a very sort of like there's a particular group of people that Jesus sort of is beefing with, and that represents probably the early Christians who are also running up against the Jewish establishment. And this is a very rife time with all kinds of problems. The Jewish establishment has a lot on their hands. They're staring down the barrel of basically what is going to be a huge insurrection. It's ultimately going to result in the destruction of the temple. By the time we get to John, 40 years later, maybe, than the Gospel of Mark, it goes from Jesus arguing with the scribes and the Pharisees to it being the Jews, all of them.
Right.
And so there's this huge explosion that happens. That's also endemic of what happens in John. There are cases in Mark where Jesus has to make mud with spit and put it in people's eyes to cure them. And by John, he literally can walk past a house and cure people. Jesus's powers grow. It's like, I don't know how it is in the UK, but in the States, we all have an uncle who, every time he tells the story of the fish that he caught, the fish gets bigger and bigger. That's the same thing that happened to Jesus's miracles. They go from, he has to put mud in people's eyes so he can just literally, walk past them and cure them by their faith. So the miracles get exploded, but also the enemy of Christianity gets exploded. And whereas there are legal debates between Jesus and the scribes and the Pharisees in Mark, it now becomes a theological debate between Jesus and his followers, who are the good guys, and the Jews and their God, who is the bad guy. And in this sort of dualistic move, the writer of John makes this rather shocking assertion that the Jews' father is the devil, or depending on how you read the Greek, and the Greek is very tortured there, and there's debate about how it should be read, and there's good evidence in antiquity to say that it was read differently than we read it now. And as you said, it says, in one way of reading it says, and your father is the devil. Another way of reading it is that that your father is the father of the devil, which is to say the Jews are the father of this other father, and that the devil is in some sense their brother. Which is
so rather than you belong to your father, the devil,
right,
you belong to the devil's father.
Yes, you belong to the father of the devil.
You belong to.
Jeżeli należą do ojca diabła, czyli do stworzyciela.
The father. So because, like you say, the Greek is ambiguous here, and you will see it translated as you belong to your father, the devil, but it can just as easily be translated as you belong to the devil's father. A little bit of a sort of a weird thing to get your head around what we're talking about there, but hopefully people are following. You say that we have some evidence that this is in fact how it was read.
Yeah, there are at least 6 different Christian groups.
So basically, znowu parafrazując szybko, budując hipotezę Demiurga, jest fragment którejś tam z Ewangelii, gdzie Jezus kłóci się z uczonymi, czy tam z Żydami generalnie, i oni mówią mu, ale przestań do nas tak mówić, my pochodzimy od Abrahama, od tego samego środka, a Jezus mówi, nie, wy jesteście synami diabła. Waszym ojcem jest diabeł. Ale okazuje się, że jest inny rodzaj tego tłumaczenia, który może być legitny, to może być mistranslacja, czyli błędne tłumaczenie, że wy należycie do ojca diabła, czyli należycie do ojca, który stworzył zarówno diabła, jak i was. I to oczywiście wspiera hipotezę Demiurga dla marsjanitów, neomarsjanitów i dla potem gnostyków, że wracamy do idei tego, że Jezus mówił do Żydów, że wy jesteście synami Demiurga, basically. Jesteście tymi złymi stworzeniami, stworzonymi przez tego złego kreatora tego wszechświata, z którym ja przybyłem walczyć.
Again, we have evidence of these Christian groups. There are at least 6 of these that have been documented. And the great book I should mention here for anyone who wants to really get into all of this is M. David Litwa's The Evil Creator. It's without any doubt the best book on this topic, and I would highly recommend that people buy it. It's a fantastic volume. Unfortunately, a little pricey because academic publishing is a malevolent demiurge itself. It's an evil cartel. But it's a bit pricey, but well worth it. And also, if you're interested in learning more about Marcion, David Litwa also has a fantastic class on Marcion that I'd really recommend people take. It's inexpensive and college level and wonderful. But what we have is that some early Christians in their individual writings did accept the idea that the Jews had as their father the devil, or rather the devil had a father. And it immediately jumps to mind, if you're reading this as an early Christian, well, who in the devil is the father of the devil? And what they would argue for is, well, the devil must have a creator. Something must have created the devil. And again, this is also to the grist of the mill of the idea that the devil is a fallen angel. That wasn't universally accepted by Jews and Christians. There are many etiological stories about where the so-called devil comes from. The idea that the devil is a rebellious angel is just one story. The more common story.
For those interested, I just did an episode like a week or 2 ago with Elaine Pagels on the origins of Satan, talking about all of the different ways in which Satan has been conceived of and where he may have come from.
Yeah, and there are dozens of these. My favorite one is the Book of Enoch, where it's just a bunch of horny teenage angels that want to come down and have sex with earth women. I find that one to be much more somehow hilarious and good. And the first woman they try to have sex with, she tricks them, which is one of my also favorite stories. That these you get the sense they're not malevolent as much as they are horny teenagers. But because of the fact that the origin of the devil is unclear, one of the things early Christians need to do is sort of figure out where the devil comes from. And it makes perfectly good sense to say, well, the devil must have been created by something. Well, what created the devil? Well, if the world is somehow not good, maybe even bad, which is an easy thing for a persecuted minority to believe, especially when you're, a tiny minority of, imagine the Jews are already a persecuted minority. Imagine being a persecuted minority in that minority. So you're getting it from both the Romans, who think your religion's ridiculous, mostly because it's new and because your leader died by crucifixion. So the Romans had two really good reasons to believe that Christianity was completely balderdash insanity. So you have the Romans, who have no interest in your religion, are actively persecuting you, and the Jews are actually, at least the Jewish leadership is also interested in persecuting you to some degree. You're living in a world in which the world is not good for you. The world is actively hostile to you. And that's difficult for modern Christians to imagine, because Christians now have religious hegemony. It's good to be a Christian in most of the world. In fact, if you're a pagan in Italy, your life is probably not so great. Everyone's Catholic, and that's the way that it is. But to put yourself back into this period where you're a persecuted minority getting it from both sides, from both the Jewish system and from the Roman system, the world is pretty bad and actively hostile to you. And evil is just apparent everywhere. It's endemic. Evil is just endemic to the world. The devil is incredibly real to these people. And it immediately asks the question, invites the question, where did the devil come from? And the answer that these Christians gave was that the devil must be created by somebody. And because the world is actively hostile and malevolent, whoever created the devil must have also created this. And this is bad. And therefore, this is bad. Whoever created this and whoever created the devil must also be bad. And it's there that we begin to get the origins, probably going all the way back to the Gospel of John, to the beginnings of this malevolent demiurge tradition.
Yeah, the answer to this mystery then of what is Jesus saying when he says, you belong to your father, the devil? Like, we don't have the same father, we come from a different place. What does this mean? One potential early reading, you belong to the devil's father, as if to say you're from the same place as the devil. That is, you are of the evil demiurge creator. And like you say, this has had perfectly benevolent and wondrous effects on the history of Judaism and its global perceptions. But we finally arrived now, I think, at what people might recognize as our typical demiurge, especially if they've come at this from the sort of Gnostic Christianity perspective. Now, when we're reading these Gnostic texts and we're hearing reference to this, we're hearing, like, Jesus, I did an episode on the Gospel of Judas, where Jesus is sort of saying to Judas, like, you know where I've really come from. Oh, but, the disciples over here, they're worshipping their God. It's really strange language that doesn't seem to make much sense. Hopefully this is beginning to sort of elucidate things for people, at least in terms of the history of the idea. This might be where it sort of comes from. So is this sort of the end of the historical story for the demiurge? Are we sort of up to date, as it were?
There's one more move, and this is the most mysterious move of all. And I have to admit, this is where we don't really know exactly what the connective tissue is. But what seems to emerge primarily in Egypt, so we're going back to Egypt, the land where Yahweh has been thought of as this god Seth for centuries. Christianity enters the scene, and we don't know if this happens parallel to Marcionism, or if Marcionism is influencing it, or if there's some mechanism that we...
Czyli teraz wracamy do Egiptu, ale już z chrześcijaństwem, gdzie pamiętajmy, w Egipcie Jahwe był uważany za Seta.
This other than that, the simple answer is that we don't know. But at least parallel to Marcion, and perhaps indirectly influenced by Marcion, because again, Marcion's churches are primarily flourishing in the East. People may know that Marcion pitched his theology to the presbyters of Rome, donated a bunch of money, and the presbyters of Rome basically said, no, here's your money back. And he huffed off and started his own church. He used all that money to basically seed his own church. One can even wonder how things would have gone if they'd have taken the money and run. It could be a whole different world. It's a huge amount of money, 200,000 sesterces or something like that. So
about 60 years labor, I think that is.
Yeah,
right?
I think it's what I tried to do the math, and it's hard to do math with ancient currency, but because you also have the Neronian debasement and stuff like that. My Roman nerds out there will perk up at the Nero killed Christians. That's one thing, but the Neronian debasement is what doomed the empire for some people. At any rate, Marcionite churches seem to flourish out east in the Greek-speaking East. Alexandria is right in the middle of the Latin, what will become the Latin West and the Greek-speaking East, and so we don't know to what degree Marcionism got a foothold in Alexandria or in the Egyptian context. But, and this is where things get quite speculative, and this is also where I've not made the next episode in the Demiurge series, so you'll get a preview of it.
Spoilers.
For reasons that
Spoilers ahead.
Spoilers alert. So for reasons that we don't fully understand, this extremely complex Baroque mythology emerges in literature like the Apocryphon of John, the Gospel of Truth, in the Gospel of Judas, it's apparent there as well. It's in the Pistis Sophia, a very unusual text, at least unusual by our accounting. I'm sure it was perfectly normal to the people that wrote it. But we have this extremely elaborate mythology. And this elaborate mythology wants to explain the next logical question, which is, if the demiurge isn't a god and the demiurge created the physical world, then the principle of sufficient reason kicks in and we have to ask the natural question: where did the demiurge come from?
Yeah, there's a sort of, when we say where did the demiurge come from, there's
Mm.
two senses in which we can mean that. There's the historical
Right.
question, like where the idea of the demiurge, where's it come from? Oh, it's a butchering of Yahweh as the donkey-headed god. Sure, but like if you believe it's true, if you like are a Marcionite and you believe that there really is this thing called the demiurge,
To ja się pytam na początku, skąd pochodzi demiurg?
there's the theological
I mówimy o mitologii, która była bardzo obecna w różnych Ewangeliach i tekstach wczesnochrześcijańskich, które zostały wycięte z Biblii, którą znamy teraz. Będziemy mówić o tym, jak o tym, zakładam, wypowiadał się Jezus i inni apostołowie. Skąd pochodzi demiurg?
question of where did it come from, not as a historical idea, as a character, but like if he actually exists.
Right, because it's
Like,
not a god.
why is there a demiurge? Why would that exist?
Right, because if you wanted to make the move and say, when people ask, well, God made the universe, and someone says, where did God come from? Well, God's eternal, and that's, as much as that is a satisfying answer, that is sort of the brute force answer. God just is eternal. You can't use that argument for the demiurge, because the demiurge isn't a god. And so insofar as the demiurge isn't a god, then the demiurge needs a cause in sort of an Aristotelian sense. So what's the origin of the demiurge? And what seems to emerge? And we don't know Marcion's answer to that, by the way. We just don't know that we don't know what his answer to that would have been. It's either lost, or I'm sure he had an answer. I mean, the Marcionite church lasted for hundreds of years. I'm sure Marcionite theologians wrestle with this idea.
Narajanina.
We just don't have their literature. But what emerges seemingly from this line of questioning is an extraordinarily complex mythology where there's a kind of unknown God that we can know nothing about, and that God is sort of the origin of all being. And some mechanism originates in that God, and out of that God flows various other sub-entities. And this region of sub-entities, who are quasi-divine perhaps, is referred to as the pleroma, the fullness. And
Jakiś ultra super wielki Bóg, z niego wylatują inne byty. Półbogowie, pomniejsi bogowie, Lovecraft się odpala.
at some point in that fullness, in that cascading out of being,
W tej
this is a very
kaskadzie
kind of,
innych
folks may
bogów,
recognize this language as
pochodzących
something
z tego
similar to
jednego Boga.
Plotinus, or something like that, although Plotinus is a bit later. At some point, there's a kind of mistake that gets made. And typically,
błąd.
one of the lower beings that gets generated is this entity known as Sophia, sort of God's wisdom. And Sophia, for a variety of
Jeden
reasons,
z
there's a variety of
bogów.
reasons given in this literature, she attempts to generate being on her own. And when she
I
attempts to
ona-
generate being on
okej.
her own, this causes what the Apocryphon of John calls an abortion. It's a sort of stillbirth. It's an entity that is existent, but existent in some kind of degenerated way. And that degenerated
Świat.
divinity, as much as it is a divinity,
Nie, okej.
that degenerated entity is outside of the pleroma, outside of that fullness, and is thrown down into the world of hule, of matter. And that matter is sort of unconstituted. It is chaotic and not formed. And that entity, in their ignorance, because they don't know where they came from, they don't know that there's a spiritual world above them, ontologically speaking, metaphysically speaking, that entity declares, I am God alone, there is no God but me. Because from their perspective, they don't know that there's anything else. And this entity begins to generate the physical world as we know it. And that entity is jealous, is rageful. That entity wants to...
Okej, jest wielki, super, ultra Bóg. Z tego ultra Boga tworzą się pomniejsi jakieś bogowie nazywani pełnią, jeżeli wierzyć tłumaczeniu AI. I jeden z tych półbogów na zasadzie błędu, czy pomniejszych bogów, na zasadzie błędu rodzi coś nieidealnego, coś, co nie wie skąd pochodzi. Taki trochę Herkules w animacji Disneya. I ten pomniejszy Bóg, narodzony jako błąd, jako aborcja, stwierdza, że stworzy świat materialny. Zaczyna brać tą boską, nieskończoną, idealną formę swoich ojców i tego wszystkiego i nakładać ją na rzeczywistość, tworząc świat materialny taki, jaki znamy. I jest zazdrosny, i jest zły, i pasuje do Jahwe.
control human beings and generates
Sounds
these
familiar.
entities. Here's the grand reveal. That entity is the entity that
Demiurg.
ultimately, through all of this machinery,
Demiurg.
becomes the entity that we now know as the demiurge, the malevolent demiurge. And what's important to know about this malevolent demiurge is that it's only malevolent in certain traditions. Certain traditions have this entity extremely malevolent, and in other traditions, for instance, the Valentinian
Teraz mowa, że w różnych tradycjach różnie się demiurga postrzega. Od bardzo złego do nie tak złego.
tradition, this entity is a bit of a doofus. He's ignorant more than malevolent.
No nie, Morderitor, bo możemy powiedzieć, że Bóg jest wieczny, koniec problemu, prawda? W sensie, to jest, wiesz, Bóg jest wieczny, come on. Ale demiurg nie jest Bogiem, bo pamiętajmy, że względem obecnej wtedy filozofii Bóg musi być dobry, a demiurg nie jest dobry, ergo demiurg nie może być Bogiem. Dlatego stworzono tą filozofię w Egipcie. Kiedy już było wczesne chrześcijaństwo, względem czego demiurg był jakimś takim pokłosiem, pomniejszym, pomylonym bóstwem, które no już nie było Bogiem, tylko było pochodnym od bogów. Innym, mniejszym bytem, który wygenerował, znaczy nałożył idealne platońskie formy, tak? Ten świat form idealnych na rzeczywistość, tworząc świat materialny.
But in both cases, this is an entity responsible for the physical world
Ciekawe, czy jest tradycja, w której jest po prostu niekompetentny, nie? Podejrzewam, że tak.
who believes that they are the God of this world and perhaps is the God of this world, whereas Christ is sort of smuggled in as a spiritual entity that ultimately results in the salvation of human beings, at least some human beings. And it's in that
A
we
Jezus
get
to już
the
w ogóle
malevolent
coś innego, to jest zbawca, który przychodzi nas uwolnić od demiurga.
demiurgical traditions, as we might call them, are the malevolent demiurgical traditions. And those manifest themselves in documents like the Apocryphon of John, which seems to have been popular among Christians. I say that because we have 3 different manuscripts of it, and we have 2 Coptic translations of it, both translations of it made independent one another. That is to say, there was someone who had a Greek text of it, they translated it into Coptic, and then someone totally independently translated it a little bit further up the Nile independently of the other one. So that means that there were at least some people, again, who knows to what degree, or can we talk about communities? There's a question about that, but at least it sort of was in the air. And Irenaeus, for his part, felt threatened enough by it to compose this famous book Against the Heresies, in which he details in very excruciating detail, accurately, but quite excruciating, this entire robust mythology. Now, the question is, where did this mythology come from? And the answer is, we don't know. My guess, and I'll put this forward as my speculation in the episode I make, is that I think it's a wedding of indigenous Egyptian mythology, where we have a similar kind of story developing in indigenous Egyptian mythology, where we have syzygies, partners, right, in the classic Egyptian mythology, and it's from those syzygy, those partners, that being ultimately results. I think my best guess is that we have a combination here of Egyptian mythology, and in some sense Christianity and the malevolent demiurge being shoehorned into that mythology, because part of what the Christians need is a mythology. They need a reason why all this is happening. And one version of the story is that, we fell from grace because Adam ate the fruit, and then Jesus has to come as a kind of great sacrifice to fix it. That's one story, and that's the one that became dominant. There are other stories. There are other stories where Jesus has to go into hell and trick the devil to get all the souls out of hell, called the sort of great the harrowing of hell, where Jesus is sort of like Rambo tricking the devil. That's a totally different theology about what Jesus is up to. The Christians need a mythology, because they have a Jesus, they have his life, they have his birth, they have his teachings, they have his death and resurrection, they have his ascension. But none of that makes any sense devoid of a bigger mythology. And Christians must develop that mythology. And when Christianity arrives in Egypt, and this is true of every Christianity throughout the world, whether it's the synthesis of the Christianity with African religion or the synthesis of Christianity with European paganism, Christianity always had the great ability to go into a region, syncretize itself to some degree, and then over the long arc itself towards so-called orthodoxy. I think what we're seeing in this strange to us, but in this unusual mythology,
Co się stało się? Well, I guess możemy się tu już zatrzymać. Czy wywaliło internet, czy co? Nie, chyba wszystko gra. Ja. Anyway. Myślę, że tu już możemy się zatrzymać. Myślę, że nieźle już rozumiemy, kim jest postać Demiurga. No było to głęboko fascynujące dla mnie. Muszę to bez bicia przyznać. A jeszcze najciekawsze jest w ogóle to, ja o Demiurgu usłyszałem po raz pierwszy tutaj. To jest gra fabularna. Nie wiem, czy wiecie, ale bardzo się grami fabularnymi interesuję. I generalnie rzecz biorąc, jest to gra horrorowa, która właśnie bierze sobie gnostycyzm. O proszę, DEMIURG na szczycie strony, która bierze sobie gnostycyzm, wierzenia te apokryfy i robi z nich świat, który jest prawdziwy. I w tej grze wcielamy się w bohaterów, którzy zaczynają zdawać sobie sprawę o tym, że istnieje Demiurg, że on jest złym stworzycielem tego świata, a my sami jesteśmy trochę takimi istotami wyższymi, które zostały przez Demiurga stworzone, a następnie przez Demiurga uwięzione. I to jest taka bardzo znana, choć bardzo kontrowersyjna gra, ale od zawsze mnie temat interesował, a nigdy jakoś osobiście tego gnostycyzmu nie zgłębiłem. A jest to mega, mega fascynujące. Kult, boskość utracona. Fascynujące. I te wszystkie istoty, światy. Kurczę, muszę jeszcze kiedyś to zagrać. O, gdybyście się zastanawiali, czemu jest ta gra kontrowersyjna, to prezentuję wam jedną z grafik poglądowych, prawda, poza granicami namiętności. Bo idea jest taka, że poprzez ekstremalne stany świadomości, czy to przez ekstremalne cierpienie, czy seks, czy tego rodzaju rzeczy, można obudzić się z tej iluzji, z tego więzienia uchnutego przez Demiurga, czyli kiedyś nazwałem to religijnym Matrixem, a teraz już wiem, że to Matrix jest świeckim gnostycyzmem, prawda? Jest taka ciekawostka. Gra, patrzę, że się pojawiają, kult, boskość utracona. To jeszcze krótka kryptoreklama, bo dlaczego nie? A propos tego rodzaju gier, mam drugi kanał, teraz raczej martwy, bo za dużo czasu zajmuje mi lupasceptyka i tak dalej, ale gramy sobie tutaj w takie gry, właśnie w tego rodzaju gry, w różnych ekipach, z różnymi ludźmi i gdzieś tutaj sobie w kult graliśmy. Już nieco dawno, ale gdzie on jest? Gdzie on jest? O, tutaj na przykład grałem z koleżanką, właśnie w kult boskość utraconą. I jeszcze gdzieś wcześniej. O, tutaj też był kult. Coś YouTube nie domaga. A chciałem pokazać. Czemu nie domaga?
Istotne jest to, że wszystkie dziewczyny...
Proszę bardzo. Oczywiście sobie gramy. Proszę
Uwaga.
bardzo.
W niniejszej historii
No anyway. To tak tylko mówię.
Uwaga.
Polecam waszej uwadze. No. Ale na dzisiaj to już chyba wszystko. Czy będzie jeszcze kult na kanale? Nie wiem. Maybe. Maybe. To co Bogu, po Sold versus lecimy kult? Ja mam problem z kultem generalnie jako grą, ale to już nie jest temat na lupę. Ale lore kultu jest super, to trzeba przyznać. Tylko znowu trzeba by to jakoś sprytnie ugryźć, a myślę, że kult nie ma pomysłu, jak to sprytnie ugryźć. To jest problem. No w każdym razie za dzisiaj wam pięknie dziękuję. Dziękuję również za top czaty, które się pojawiły, za pytania i za aktywność na czacie. Przyznam, że dla mnie temat demiurga gnostycyzmu jest fascynujący. Taki lore boski wynikający z danej interpretacji świętych tekstów chrześcijańskich. Nie jest to bezpodstawne, powiedziałbym. Powiedziałbym nawet, że na moje, jak se patrzę na świat, to raczej demiurg niż wszechmiłosierny stworzyciel wszechświata, gdybym miał wybierać. No ale cóż. Także na dziś serdecznie wam dziękuję. Pozostańcie sceptyczni oczywiście względem wszystkiego i widzimy się na kolejnym streamie. Może jeszcze w tym tygodniu, zobaczymy jak wyjdzie, albo może w przyszły weekend jak zawsze. Gdzieś tam sobota, niedziela, poniedziałek, piątek to są terminy, gdzie na pewno jakieś streamy będą. Dziękuję ślicznie i życzę wszystkim dobrej nocy.